and I know probably little to nothing about politics, especially compared to the room.
Michael.
So I'm here to be the class clown or like comfort bed. If anyone thinks they made a dumb point, I'm here to take the blow.
One sec. Chill.
Okay, but
we haven't gone live, so we're just starting to go live.
So technical difficulties. We're back on now.
We are officially
math major.
live.
I helped Tiger a bit write sort of a piece on how. Oh, wait. Oh, okay. I'm waiting. Okay.
Michael, I promise you will get a chance to tell everyone your credentials.
Okay. All right. Really looking.
We're gonna run it back.
All right.
This is going great. Okay. So everything is officially live right now. It wasn't live before, but now we're live. Just a quick intro for everybody again. I'm Tiger Gao. I'm the host of Policy Punchline. I've been doing this for 2 years. We've never done an elections live coverage, but this year, 2020, crucial election. I'm right in the heart, Washington, D.C. with my friend Mark. We're going to present to you a 4-hour live stream about all kinds of issues, from issues like mass vaccination policy to polarization and political discourse. We're going to predict the election. We're going to do all kinds of stuff. So we're officially live, and we're going to do this thing. Why don't we quickly go around, brief introduction about who you are, and then we'll jump into election forecasting.
Yeah, so once again, I'm Mark Chabon. I'm a senior political science major at George Washington University. Done campaign work, done advocacy work, done government work, and tonight we're doing predictive work because I'm going to tell everybody what's going to happen. Go ahead, Jack.
Sorry, I'm getting caught up in the election. My name's Jack. I'm a senior at Princeton Economics. I know Tiger from our many economics classes we've taken together, many shenanigans he's gotten us into in class. I'm a big fan of politics. I follow things very closely. I follow polls very closely. I follow the prediction markets closely. I'm a lurker on election Twitter. For any of you who know what that is, Jay Miles, Coleman, Dave Wasserman, all that good stuff. I've done campaign work as well for local races in Pennsylvania where I live. I'm also an elected official in Pennsylvania, although I'm not. I'm riding comfortable now. No, I'm not on the ballot this year. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about predicting the election, some of the initial results already coming in right now as we speak, what that means for the rest of the race, what we can infer. So I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
I'm Arjun. Sorry, also caught up in the election. So I'm a senior in the computer science department. Been known Tiger since freshman fall, so we go pretty way back. In terms of the election kind of things, I enjoy following the election a lot. I read a lot about the issues, as well as I enjoy talking about sort of how you predict things and how you kind of model things in these uncertain situations. And so I'm excited to share my perspective and hear from others today. So yeah.
Alex, Michael, who wants to go?
You're in the same order.
Sure. I'm Alex. I graduated from Princeton in the spring. I'm going to talk a little bit today about healthcare specifically, possibly Joe Biden's plan, if he were able to implement that. And then some other Policy Punchline colleagues will talk about the current challenge in the court to the Affordable Care Act. Additionally, for me personally, I am not a huge election nerd, but I'm a big podcast listener. So big fan of The Weeds and the Ezra Klein Show from Vox and a couple other more left-leaning ones to sort of have a spread of the podcast space. So yeah, happy to talk about it.
I am Michael. I'm a math major. I've known Tiger for quite some time. I probably have the least political expertise here, but my perspective is mainly going to be in this first 20 minutes, sort of talking about, I have some experience in statistical modeling in more of a business scenario. So sort of bringing those insights to how I think, from my point of view, election forecasting could be improved if we look at it in a different way.
So why don't we jump right in? We're going to switch to Jack's prediction and then see what's going on. Jack, would you like to explain to us the state of the play right now?
Yeah, sure. So I have 3 maps to present to everyone today. One is my prediction, although I've already had to. I'll talk about why I'm wrong already with that. One is what a Trump win might look like, and the other is what a large Biden win would look like. So for those of you watching right now, maybe some of you have better information than I do if you've been, obsessively checking the results. Some of the results are already in. What have we learned so far? The states that were obviously going to go to Biden or Trump have been called: Vermont, Virginia. Virginia, once a swing state back in the Bush years, now easily winnable by Democrats. Those have all been called. So those that have closed so far. So what's the interesting stuff? First of all, Midwestern states. Looking at the rural counties, Biden is doing much. Obviously, Trump is still running away with it in the rural counties. Biden is doing much better on the margin than Hillary did. He has a higher raw support than Hillary, and Trump is either matching his totals from 2016 or doing slightly worse. I'm looking at Indiana right now, and just to give an example real quick, Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is in the Northeast, the county where that's in, right now, Trump has 55% and Biden has 43%. Hillary got in the 30s there. Trump got 58% in 2016, if I remember correctly. So again, those are just small margins. But what does that tell us? If those trends hold in other states like Pennsylvania, those kind of Midwestern Rust Belt states, that's a good sign for Biden. Now, the other big news is in Florida, where Trump it looks like Trump is going to pull off an upset. People thought, based on the early numbers, that Biden would win. However, it seems like the Cuban vote, the Hispanic vote, the Latinos for Trump have already come out, have shifted hugely towards Donald Trump, which is a very big surprise. And I'll talk about that once we get into the maps. So with that said, just kind of the lay of the land here, why don't we jump right into the first map? I don't know what order we have them, but I can talk about why I think why I have my prediction, the Trump win and the Biden big win. So, Tiger, I don't know, are you sharing that on Zoom or should I just pull it up myself?
We're on Biden big win right now. Tell us what's good.
All right, so
we're on the map. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were going to pull it up. So anyway, let me pull that up here. But so you'll see in here the southern, so Georgia, Texas. I believe I have those going blue in this example here. Sorry, give me 2 seconds, and I can have this up for everyone. Well, at least for me. All right, so the Biden win. So big win. So we have Arizona, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida going blue. Now, like I said, Florida already, that's going to go Trump. Pretty much. It hasn't been called officially, but that's it would be there's basically no path for victory. The remaining votes are almost all in the northern panhandle portion of the state of Florida. That's very conservative. Trump has just taken the lead, I believe, by very narrow margins. That's definitely going to go Trump. However, we're seeing Georgia right now. Texas has just started to announce voting. The late polls here started to show some momentum for Biden. And initially, it was seen as kind of a long shot. We remember in 2018, Beto O'Rourke tried to unseat Ted Cruz. He came very close, but couldn't do it, but spent a ton of money trying to do it. So now Democrats are hoping that they can keep that momentum going. I think if you see putting Florida's results aside, if we see that big Biden win or big Biden turnout, polls may be underestimating Biden in some instances. Texas could vote for Biden by a narrow margin. I think Georgia's the most likely, though. We've seen some pretty good polls showing Biden with a very narrow lead in Georgia. Some of the early voting numbers out of Georgia look decent. I haven't had time to dive into completely, but that's kind of the thought there, is that the polls lately have been tied, have been very close to even a little bit of a Biden advantage. So if Biden's doing very well, he could easily win Georgia and carry some down ballot races like in the state legislature too. Arizona, we know from 2018, voted for Kyrsten Sinema in the Senate. That was the first time a Democrat represented Arizona in many years in the Senate. Obviously, once the home of noted conservatives like John McCain, Barry Goldwater. Democrats, I think, feel good about Arizona, although it's, again, going to be extremely close. A lot of Republicans spend a lot of time there. Ted Cruz was campaigning there. So again, if Biden is able to do well, especially in Maricopa County, that's where Phoenix is. Most people in Arizona live. That's where we're seeing shifts to Democrats from 2018. So if they can get that going, they can pull it off. North Carolina, a little bit of the same story there. A lot of people have been moving there. It's growing in population. We hear about like the research triangle. So there's more younger educated people moving there. Barack Obama won the state in 2008. And Donald Trump only won it by about 1%, I believe, in 2016. So it's totally in play for both campaigns. This is really just about winning, driving up those numbers, I think, in the suburbs for Biden, and hopefully doing not as poorly with the rural voters, which, like I said, based on some other results, Biden might have a belief that he can do well there. And then, of course, the rest of the classic blue wall states, the Pennsylvania, the Michigan, the Wisconsin, the Minnesota, the states that typically have tended to vote Democrat, that some of which Donald Trump flipped in 2016. I just saw some early vote numbers out of Allegheny County. That's where Pittsburgh is. The early vote by mail. I don't think it's all the ballots. Biden has an enormous lead in the vote by mail. It's looking very good for him right now. Initially, these are very early, so plenty of things can change. But regardless, I don't know how likely this big win is now, especially since Florida is going to go Trump. But regardless, so now we can move on. Why don't you guys switch to the my official prediction, the one where I have a few states going for Trump that I don't have on the big map. So once
we got that pulled up on YouTube right now.
Awesome. So here we see Texas, Georgia. I have them going red. I see, like I said, with Florida, that is obviously already gone red. Biden can still win without Florida. It's not a death blow. He could also lose Arizona and North Carolina, I believe, if I'm doing the mental math correctly, and still win. But I think this is likely, and here's why. Trump has not really led in any good polls in North Carolina lately. There have been a few polls that have been put out by more conservative pollsters that, they say they're trying to do it to correct for errors that the mainstream polls miss. Of course, Donald Trump could still win, but we've also seen, interestingly, within North Carolina, that the Senate candidates there, Tom Tillis, the Republican incumbent, and Cal Cunningham, the scandal, who famously now has a sex scandal, another North Carolina politician with a sex scandal, imagine that. They've been doing better than Biden has. And the governor, Roy Cooper, a Democrat in North Carolina, who won the election when Trump won the state, is doing better than them all. So it's kind of the question we have to ask is it possible for Trump to win this state while also voting for a Democrat in the Senate? That's very possible. But I think it's much more likely, how much more likely, I don't know, but more likely that those stronger Democratic numbers for the Senate, especially, may carry Joe Biden. People going in, maybe they think they're voting Cal Cunningham, the Democrat, for Senate. Donald Trump, they might go, I don't know. Not a lot of ticket splitting. So we'll see. But I think North Carolina is a tilt Democrat state. Same reason for Arizona. A lot of polls have shown Mark Kelly, the Senate candidate, ahead of the incumbent. I don't think Martha McSally, the Republican incumbent in Arizona, has led in any good polls. Mark Kelly's definitely going to win the Senate. It would be an absolute upset if he lost. So I think that's another example of as long as that support for Mark Kelly translates into people also voting for Biden, that he can run across the finish line. And I already touched on Pennsylvania, the blue wall, so to speak. Like I said, we've even seen good numbers out of Ohio too for Biden. So, I have it lean Trump. Trump has been leading in polls there slightly, but you never know. But again, so I think the big takeaway why I feel good about this right now is based on the early numbers out of the Midwest. Rural counties are not doing as poorly. All right, Tiger's telling me to wrap it up here. So I'll just leave you with this, the punchline. Biden is doing well in the suburbs. There's a lot of high turnout there, especially in Pennsylvania. He's doing well in the polls, better than Hillary did. And the rural vote so far doesn't look like it's going to go as far for Trump. Should we skip the Trump win, or do we want to, Tiger?
Should we move on to Arjun's map really quickly and Mark's map, and so that we can dive into the meat of the how people do forecasting? That's
all right. Let's do it.
So our map is up. You have Biden at 321, Trump at 216. Tell us why.
Yeah. So I have to admit, first of all, that there's kind of I guess I cheated a little bit in that I had Florida blue about 2 hours ago, and I just changed it about right before I sent the map. So yeah, Florida's going to go red. I think Biden has actually done slightly better among white voters, throughout most of the state. But basically, he's just severely underperformed Clinton and Miami-Dade, and that mostly is due to sort of underperformance among Cuban American voters. And so I think Clinton had a 63% of the vote there, and Biden had 54 last I saw. And so that's that. I mean, it's difficult to come back from that. So Florida's going red. I think in terms of the other states, right? So really the things to look for, in terms of the Rust Belt, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, those are states that all went for Trump by very narrow margins in 2016. I think the polls generally look positive in Wisconsin and Michigan, so I expect that Biden will carry those. It's tighter in Pennsylvania, but I do expect that Biden will still carry it, but by a smaller margin than the polls say. So I expect maybe a 2 or 3 point win there. And so I'm going to give all of those states to Biden just based on the strength of the polling, and I think especially since like a lot of the suburban voters and a lot of women are moving away from Trump, I see that movement kind of allowing Biden to clinch these states. And I think like that might be playing out based on the results in Ohio right now. Again, like the results that we were seeing from Ohio right now are mostly early voting. So it's going to be heavily Democratic, and so we should expect that. At the same time, like Biden is running up margins that we would not have expected in these sort of counties where you would expect Trump to be strong because it's kind of more working class kind of thing. I still expect that Trump will take Ohio, but again, Trump took Ohio by like 8 points in 2016. I expect it's going to be closer to 1 or 2 points in 2020, and that bodes well for Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that's sort of up in the Rust Belt. That's where I'm thinking, and I think Minnesota should go for Biden. In terms of the rest of the Sun Belt, so I have Arizona going for Biden. I think like the fact that Mark Kelly, as Jack said, is a super strong Senate candidate will probably take Biden across the line, and polling has been looking good for him. So I think that he will carry Arizona narrowly. I'm also sort of bullish on Georgia. I think that like Biden has a pretty decent shot in Georgia. Like things are moving pretty fast in demographically favorable terms towards the Democrats. But we'll see. I don't know. Like maybe Trump holds on in Georgia. Again, it's a traditionally Republican state, right? Again, in North Carolina, I also think that polling has shown a pretty steady Biden lead. I think this is kind of a state that people are sleeping on and assuming that Trump will kind of carry it. But I do think that like North Carolina could be an important factor in a potential Biden victory. So that's kind of how I'm sort of thinking of things, and then that gives Biden 321. Again, if Trump sweeps the Sun Belt, which could happen, then things become very dicey, right? Because now you're looking at Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and really I think Pennsylvania becomes the keystone state, which I think is a scenario that people have kind of thought of. So we'll see. I don't know.
All right, Mark, you want to go next? I got your map on YouTube right now.
I do. So I've heard a lot of great academic arguments, I think, in this first 10 minutes. And I understand why. This is a very, very strange election. I think you're seeing, especially after 2016, there's a reluctance to say definitively what will happen, what won't happen. We have division. There's riots. There's the possibility of a contested election. There's the polarization and the debates, over the efficacy of the polling, which Tiger obviously did his op-ed on. But to me, all of these things are basically mute in the end. When it comes down to it, every election is based on one thing, which is the economy. And you have this president today, which has failed to keep the American people safe from the COVID pandemic, and by that also failing to keep his one prized possession, which is the economy, safe. And so if there's one thing the American people can't forgive, it's a weak economy. And you will notice on my map, there are no toss-ups, there are no lean states, because in an election, there are no toss-ups in lean states. There are only winners and losers. And Joe Biden is going to win tonight because Donald Trump has failed in everything that he said he would do. And I'm predicting a full sweep. The only state I think Joe Biden won't win, and the only toss-up he won't win, is Texas. And other than that, across the board, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, across the board, I think Joe Biden will win. I think the Democrats will take the Senate, they will keep the House, and we will go from there.
It's a big blue sweep, basically. You're very, very optimistic.
Big blue sweep. Very bullish on the Democratic sweep.
Okay, perhaps we can talk a little bit more high level about what the hell is going on with the elections polling, because Jack, Michael, Arjun, we all wrote a recent op-ed published on policypunchline.com. You can read it there, which is called Bayesian's Journey Election Season. What does Bayesian mean? It's a statistical methodology and philosophical framework adopted by the most famous pollster, Nate Silver. And he's a Bayesian himself. And the way Bayesian does things is that they have a certain set of prior beliefs that they start from. They sample a small group of data sets, and then they keep updating based on those. So we can go a little bit deeper on that front as well. But maybe, Michael, would you like to quickly walk us through some of the arguments you made? Because you wrote the very provocative headline called, "Is Nate Silver worse than crackhead Jim?" Why did you say that? What is going on?
The main point that I wanted to get ahead with crackhead Jim is that I think the community of pollsters and polling needs to be able to criticize themselves. Am I saying that they're bad? No, but you have to take last year as sort of a ding, right? If you look at Nate Silver's prediction of, 16% Donald Trump, I think it was before like things started to happen. Sure, like a 16% chance still can happen. You can say, okay, well, Nate Silver could have still been right and the 16% chance happened. But the reality of the situation is we can't go back and redo the election to see if actually 16% of the time Trump would win. So his prediction, if we want to rate a prediction, you have to sort of rate the prediction method and how it works. And the most standard way I can think of rating it is saying, okay, did the most likely winner actually win? Did he get the weighted coin correct? But, a lot of pollsters in the 2016 election got the wrong thing. The whole crackhead Jim thing was just saying, if you're giving 16% odds, like good odds, then if crackhead Jim just says 50-50 for each candidate every 4 years without thinking of anything, then he's going to be called great as well. So the whole point of all this, like ignoring crackhead Jim and all of this, is I think it's very important for the polling and pollsters community, now that we're using a lot more advanced methods like Monte Carlo integration for very, avant-garde, tailored random variables to these states. I think it's very important to start realizing if there may be a flaw in a system, because some of the best forecasting that we have today have grown a lot out of recognizing that it has flaws. So you can't give Nate Silver excuses for pulling a 16% for Trump when he won. And the two main examples I can think of off the top of my head are for weather forecasting. So the first time we started using computers to forecast.
Sorry to cut you off right there, but I think maybe just to quickly clarify it to some of our listeners, some people would say 16% likelihood is very good. And by the way, Nate Silver eventually predicted Trump to be winning around 30% odds on the before the election night. And because why do I say that 16% odds is pretty good is because 16% is essentially a 1 in 6, which is a roll of a dice, right? And if you think about it, that is not really a bad odds that he gave Trump even before the night, which is 30%, which is very, very high odds. So one could simply say that if you looked at 16% odds and you just simply wrote Trump off, you just don't understand statistics. What are you doing, man? You don't understand statistics, and now you're blaming Nate Silver for being wrong. So I would actually say Nate Silver was right all along.
Okay, so you can take that lens if you want. If the community of pollsters takes that lens for every polling, even if you think of the worst case scenarios, right, where every time they predict that what ends up being the winner is 10%, then what we end up seeing is that a system for making these like odds that is very flawed never gets criticized. So for what I was about to go into historically, for the mathematical models we use for stock markets and for the mathematical models we use for weathering, both of those fields went through phases of they brought in some new advanced method that was black box. People didn't fully understand how everything worked. It turned out to not work so well. For stocks and weather, it's super easy to check if it doesn't work, right? Rain, we get like every day. Elections, we get every 4 years, right? There's no way to go back and redo election to see if your odds were right or wrong, right? So it's even harder to realize if your method is not great here. But for every forecasting field that is using methods that are still a little bit black box, and you can definitely argue like the pollsters' methods are a little bit black box. Every one of these fields had a regime where everyone realized, okay, something's going wrong with this. How do we possibly fix it? Just took a step back, looked at how everything was going, made improvements, and then it became great. Weather forecasting, obviously everyone has their phone and it does a good job of telling what the rain is. And any quant firm is learning how to deal with, what happened after COVID, where we saw the performance of them drop a ton, right? That's the general spiel. Am I saying they suck? Maybe, maybe not, who knows? But I think if you're looking from even a pollster's point of view, if you're one in the pollster community, then there needs to be some system of judgment set up where you're saying, okay, maybe there is room for improvement for how we're doing polling, and maybe we should be looking into that for the next 4 years. But that's just my general mathematician, distant from politics, not ever seeing how pollsters actually work perspective.
I think Michael, you make a good point about outcomes. I think something, like intuitively, let's say, there's two different pollster or, Nate Silvers, right? Nate Silver 1, Nate Silver 2. One of them says, oh, Biden has a 60% chance to win. The other one says Biden has a 65% chance to win. There's not a lot of disagreement there, but clearly they're using something different between their models, right? And unless you do we wait decades for them to run all these different models on presidential elections, it's going to take a long time before we know who's better. And I think what you're kind of getting at is that, it's easy to kind of obfuscate, whatever.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to overlook differences in Trump won, he had him at 30%, but we would be saying the same thing if Nate Silver had him at 20% too, right? There's only either Trump wins or Biden wins, or Trump wins or Hillary wins, and it's not a continuous outcome. So I think, a response to that is something that I don't think people do, but maybe should start doing, is we use these models not to predict just binary outcomes, but also continuous ones. If you have these models looking at demographics of voters and going deep into the crosstabs of the polls, saying, all right, independents in Midwest states are leaning this way towards Trump or Biden, you should be able to come up with a model to predict what the margins are going to be in certain, congressional districts, in certain states, in certain counties, swing counties, bellwether counties. You should be able to say, well, based on my model, based on the economy, based on the number of new COVID cases, based on the polls, I predict that, let's say, the Philadelphia suburbs are going to have X, Biden's going to win it by X votes this year. I think, and this is kind of a way forward, I think. If you start doing that, it's a lot easier to compare. It's more tangible to say, all right, Nate Silver won, who had Biden at 60%, maybe thinks, Joe Biden will win the suburbs by 12%. And 65% Biden, Nate Silver too, says, no, it's going to be 14%. And that, I think, I don't know, no one's really doing that now. I don't think, you see a lot of, especially on Twitter, a lot of people who are really involved in politics saying, well, if these trends continue, I expect Biden to win this county by this much. But it's more intuition, general trends. It's never these advanced Bayesian models. And I would really think it'd be awesome, especially in the long term, if pollsters started using those to kind of make those predictions, make those continuous variable predictions, so we can have better, calculate error of your model better, and we don't need to wait 50 years to find out which Nate Silver is the best.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is generally what I want out of this kind of discussion. Not just pollster shots suck. We shouldn't listen to them, yada, yada. I think right now there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. So it shouldn't oh, Nate Silver, he must be right, yada, yada. But what I would hope would come from this discussion is what we saw with weather forecasting, and what we're seeing now with quant finance after the whole COVID crisis is, getting better models in the future. Obviously for some people that's good. For some people, they just want to have their sports game and not know what the hell's going to go on for the election. But I think for the pollster community, I think that having a healthy look at specifically 2016, we'll see about 2020 and say that was a flop. Okay, maybe we should start looking at things and see what we can do better. That is generally a healthy perspective for the pollster community.
I find this interesting.
What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I so at least my initial take would be was inclined to say that maybe we're overfitting to 2016 in the sense that I think polling was accurate in many ways in both the national and state levels in all previous elections, or in many previous elections before. To be in a time in I guess, to make a sort of more philosophical statement, we seem to be in the kind of time right now, politically and ideologically, that there's just kind of a realignment that's happening. And what I see is when you see the Rust Belt, which is generally traditionally a little bit more democratic, especially Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all shifting closer to Trump, and you see the Sun Belt slowly shifting towards Biden demographically. I think we're seeing these changes that we would expect to, if you had normal candidates, right, and you were in a normal political environment, you would expect these changes to occur gradually. But I think that the fact that something like Texas isn't played this election, right, indicates that these changes are happening at a kind of pace where pollsters are not really able to adapt, right? So I think that that's something to keep in mind, is that the pace at which demographics and the pace at which states are shifting either from red to blue or blue to red are so fast that I tend to have more sympathy for pollsters. So that's one point, right? Second point is I think I agree with the point that as long as the whole crack at Jim thing of if they predict 50% for each candidate, they can always say that we gave the candidate who won enough odds and we gave the candidate who lost enough odds. I think there are still ways to. So I mean, you can still like binarize a probability distribution, right? You can still say like, let's see whether they predicted the candidate who actually won based on like, giving the maximum probability, right? Taking the maximum probability candidate. And if you do that, I would suspect, right? If you sort of go back and look at, Nate Silver's predictions, I would suspect that he's probably gotten it right most of the time, except for 2016. So there's two ways to evaluate, right? Then the other thing is like, when the outcome is indeed incorrect, how much uncertainty did you give, right? In that sense, I give Nate Silver more credit because even in 2016, there was more uncertainty that he gave for a Trump win, right? I think it was 30% odds, right, on election day. A lot of other models, I think, had like 10%, 5%, even 2% odds, things like that. It's just occurring to me now. So I'm circling back to the first point. I also think that like the whole Bayesian approach, right? It's the idea is that you have priors, you have prior beliefs about what you think is the important things to that matter in the presidential election, right? And so like usually that's like, okay, well, the state of the economy and things like that, right? So those are valid priors, but then to go back to my first point about things changing so rapidly right now and demographics changing, those are maybe not the correct priors to have anymore, and we don't know. Like we're in such an uncertain political environment. So it's harder for me to say like these are the priors that we should choose based on past data. Because I don't think past data is necessarily reliable for actually establishing priors for the current political environment. So I think that's something to sort of think about with regards to using Bayesian methods.
I think just to quickly clarify for our listeners about the Bayesian method, if you're just joining. So the Bayesian method is fundamentally different from their opposite side, which is the frequentist method, because Bayesians are essentially saying, so the frequentists would say, because let's say you want to infer how many Americans will actually vote for Trump, that will be a fixed number, right? On election day, you will know that number. So if it's a fixed number, if it's not random, then there's no point of assigning some probability distribution to it. And then the Bayesians are very innovative in the sense that they would say, yes, you still can. It's like, sure, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't go around literally asking every American about their opinion, but you could still assign a probability distribution to that unknown parameter and say, I think maybe there's a 25% chance that this could happen. There's a 35% chance that this could happen. So you see the Bayesian method allows you to make predictions with very small data sets, and presidential elections are a very small data set, right? You don't have that much data to work with, so you have to go in with certain prior beliefs, and you use that prior belief, and then you say, how do I sample some more data, go around, poll some more people, use some more new data to test that belief that I go in with, right? So that's what Arjun was saying, is that if you went in with an incorrect prior, it may take many rounds of elections and many polling in order to actually correct that belief, and that is a very difficult process for pollsters. So to Nate Silver's credit, what he's doing right now, I think, is a fundamentally very beautiful statistical process, right? It's a very iterative process. To get to the truth, you get some data, you go in with a prior belief, but you're always willing to update your belief, and you're always updated. That's why we see all the simulations on Nate Silver's website, and we see him constantly adjusting his odds. And I think that's a really valiant effort in that sense, and very innovative way of doing election forecasting. But I guess just to add on to your point, Arjun, about how we can actually hold pollsters accountable, and also to refute your point, Michael, I think we can entirely hold pollsters accountable by tallying up their performances over many elections, their predictions, right? So, for example, Michael, you said Crackhead Jim would predict 50% chance of Biden winning or Trump winning in every single election. But Nate Silver would adjust his odds. Sometimes he would say a 16% versus 82%, sometimes 10% versus 90%. And you can tally up all the distributions, all the probability he assigned to those people. And on average, he will likely have a much higher average of the probability he assigned to the winning candidate compared to someone like Crackhead Jim. So I disagree with you, Michael, because I think we can totally evaluate the posters. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts beyond that. So
no. So the point for Crackhead Jim was exactly what you just said, was that you need to make an evaluation of ticking how many people they predict will win versus won't win over time, or else your anomaly is someone like Crackhead Jim, which whatever value metric you're using to value how good a pollster is, like he's just going to come up on top. If 16% is still good for Trump, then 50% is great. So like what you said is exactly the point of that analogy, is to say, okay, if we want to look at the performance of pollsters, right, from a more practical lens, right? If we want to try to have some sort of lens to say, or do they potentially need some sort of fixing, right? This is the whole idea of like, if you'll never admit you're wrong, I'll never tell you you're right, right? If there's some way to say, okay, these are not working well, I think that's healthy for the field of pollsters to know when it should readjust. And as Arjun was saying too, right, like elections are sort of hard to gauge if you're just in this little Trump bubble of things not working well, or if this really is a paradigm shift and we should think of adjusting these like black box methods for the pollsters, right? That's really tough to say, but I would argue that it's healthier to lean on the side of error than on the side of everything is good, as in on the side of maybe there is something that we can fix. But that's the main spiel of Crackhead Jim is exactly what you were saying, that you need to make that sort of evaluation for pollsters.
Arjun, Jack, any thoughts on this issue? Any more thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just like, final, like, I mean, I think my trust for polls was like higher than most in 2020, because I think a lot of people said that polls are bullshit after what happened in 2016. That said, right, like at least the first data point of the night, right, Biden was up in the poll average in Florida by I think 2 or 3 points, and Trump is going to end up winning that by about 3 points, which is by Florida standards is a massive landslide victory. So that's something to consider, right, in the sense that like it looks like polls completely missed, like, so when the Miami-Dade numbers came and Biden had like incredibly bad numbers compared to what Clinton had in 2016 when she lost the state, people were shocked, right? So clearly pollsters missed something again, right? There was always this like worry about Cuban Americans, but nobody had a sense that it was this bad. So something is being missed, right? Maybe that's a unique to Florida phenomenon, or maybe that's something that we see playing out across the Sun Belt in 2020. We'll see. But like our first data point of the night in terms of like a swing state that we know the outcome of now is a pretty significant polling error on the magnitude of probably about 5 points. That's pretty big. So, yeah.
Jack, I know you had some thoughts about whether we should trust the polls and things like that. What do you think on that front? I mean, because the pollsters did kind of miss in the 2016, but we are saying that they are overcorrecting this year.
Yeah, well, so one of the reasons I think it's let's talk about the polls in 2016. In 2016, the national polls were pretty accurate. They predicted about a 2 to 3 point Hillary win in terms of the popular vote, and they were pretty much dead on with that. However, the problem is when you start looking at certain swing states. I think there's a misconception that all polls were wrong across the states. That's not necessarily true. In Florida in 2016, the New York Times Siena poll, which is a very highly rated pollster by 538, had Trump +3, and he ended up winning, even though I think the polling average was like Hillary plus 0.5 or something like that. So it was very close. But I mean, even this year, Biden had a narrow lead in Florida, and I believe Decision Desk HQ has called Florida for Trump. So why are our polls just terrible? So the reason that the people say the polls were off is largely due to the fact. Yeah, largely due to the fact that state polls often they have to weight their samples, right? So you run a poll in a state, you get a certain amount of Democrats, certain Republicans, certain independents, and you want to match it to the state's overall levels because otherwise your sample is not representative. So people will scale them. However, the other problem is it's more than just Republican, Democrat, Independent. You also have to look at education. Are they blue collar, white collar, income? Because if you don't look at that, your poll sample might also, overrepresent a certain group. Obviously, in 2016, Trump did extremely well in rural counties, white counties. A lot of the, former, and you might call them ancestrally Democratic areas that used to be very pro-union. Now those have kind of disappeared. The manufacturing's on the decline. If state polls didn't account, didn't weight their polls correctly in terms of how lower education, then that's a bad term. We shouldn't say lower education, makes it sound dumb or something, but the blue collar workers who don't have college degrees, if they weighted them incorrectly, they're going to underestimate Trump's support. And that's kind of what happened. You saw pollsters admitting this. And in theory, in 2018, most major polls were pretty accurate in most states. And, they felt they've corrected for that. Although again, so in general, I was going to point out in Florida today, you see the polling averages were a little off, but going back to can we trust them? I think mostly yes. You just need to make sure when you look at a poll, don't just average polls together. Look at their methodology. Look at their who is their sample. Who are they sampling? How did they do it? Because if you have a very unusual sample, you're going to get funky results, either in pro-Biden or pro-Trump. And sometimes it's helpful to look at more specific polls. For example, I know I mentioned this to you, Tiger, and this will be the last thing I say. In 2016, there were polls about a week before the election of congressional districts in New York, in upstate New York, which obviously everyone thought would go for Clinton, and it did. But this was a district Obama carried, and it showed Trump with a big lead, a double-digit lead, and he ended up winning with a double-digit lead. And that was unusual because no one would have expected that at the time. And what you saw is that districts that were like that, the upstate New York, the more rural areas, also had this large shift towards Trump, like northeastern Pennsylvania. Northeastern Pennsylvania voted for Trump by 8, 9, or 10 points, I think, even as it elected Democrats down ballot. So that shift, which was kind of missed due to that weighting error, it caught everyone by surprise. Now, I don't know. We'll have to see how the polls work out this year. I think most people are confident that they're going to be better this year, but who knows? We'll see.
Yeah, so somebody sort of just add on to that, right? Like in terms of, I think my views on polling are becoming like more negative in real time. But like, in Ohio, right? So in all these Rust Belt states, in like basically the big error in 2016 was that you were undercounting white voters without college degrees, right? That was sort of the big error. Is that you weren't waiting for education. Right, polls were not waiting for education, so you ended up oversampling voters with college degrees who tend to lean more Democratic. But actually, like the non-college degree white working class population tends to also vote in very high numbers, and they vote in very high numbers for Trump in particular. Right, so a lot of the polling in the Rust Belt states now in 2020 to try to correct for what they did in 2016 is now weighting by education. Right, so what that means is that like if you have 2 times the amount of college grads in your poll, then you sort of give each person in your give each non-college educated voter a weight of 2 in order to sort of correct for that bias, or sort of any sort of weight that balances out your oversampling. The reason that oversampling occurs is because college grads tend to be more responsive to pollsters. So these are the kind of changes that have occurred in polling, especially in the Rust Belt states. In 2020. Now the question is whether that is now overcorrected, right? So this is why I'm not sure about like how arbitrary polling is that like, okay, well, we look at 2016, we overfit to our errors, and now we actually overcorrect in the opposite direction where we overestimate Trump support maybe in these Rust Belt states. So like an example of that might be, and again, Ohio is it's still early. There's only 50% of the vote in, but Biden is doing better than we might have expected, right? Again, like a lot of the Republican counties have not voted. I really don't know what the end result is going to be, but he's doing better than we might have expected at this point in time. And I think that's something to like think about with regards to like maybe Ohio is in a positive direction, right? So it seems to me that like a lot of these decisions that pollsters have to make are arbitrary, and they are forced to overfit on small data because by definition there's only a small amount of data points. So maybe this is just more arbitrary and harder to really pin down than it may seem. So yeah, I mean.
Before we move on, I mean, we're already way over time on this polling section, but there's one quick question I want to ask you guys is whether we should forecast what I would call regime changing or black swan events that might completely break your model, right? For example, there's a very, very high likelihood that we go into a contested election tonight. I mean, I think the previous results were saying that there's only a 15-20% likelihood that we get the results on election night because of the mail-in ballots, because of some of the multiple states will be contested in some way down the road. So if we are not even going to find out who the winner is going to be until like a week later or 2 weeks later, shouldn't you forecast that, build that into your model? I mean, I don't know if we should consider Trump as a regime-breaking event, but he broke the model, right? I mean, in a way, assuming that Nate Silver was wrong, assuming. So my point is, let's say Trump pulls out a coup. Let's say Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation lets the Supreme Court swing some way. Again, very hypothetical situations, but should you incorporate some of those probabilities into your models?
Tiger, I have a slight quick thought on this, and sorry for those who are here already. I'm a bit of a latecomer, so I missed the bulk of the debate that you all are having, which is very interesting. Arjun, in the vein of polling errors, I think that there's a lot to talk about that we could get into briefly about Georgia and Florida. Texas also, apparently. I don't know if you all have been following the latest on that, but that's quite interesting. All that aside, and believe me, I love to make fun of pollsters more than anybody, but that's neither here nor there. But Tiger, to sort of flip it around to you for somebody that has like a very little kind of probability statistics background, my question would be, if you're talking about incorporating like black swan events, right, which are inherently unpredictable kind of cataclysmic things, what would be the point of trying to build something like that in? Would be my question, because they're right. The very nature of what you're talking about is something that is completely random.
Yeah, that's a good question. Good question.
It is something that is completely random, but if you can foresee that something completely random is going to happen, should you, for example, we could say that there's a 5% chance likelihood that just bad stuff will happen, illegal stuff will happen, or like we don't know what that will be. But
that's a different question, though, because those are predictable things. You're asking about unpredictable things. A black swan event is something definitionally that is unpredictable, right? That's a paradigm shifting thing. Whereas what you're talking about, which is legal intervention on the part of attorneys, is quite predictable and indeed very possible thing tonight.
And if it's predictable and possible, okay, let's forget about the terminology black swan events. If that is predictable and possible, should we take that into our current consideration then? Because that's I
like where you're going, but I think it's unquantifiable.
Yeah, I think that's what Arjun's critique as well for me a couple of days ago, right? So
yeah. So I would
yeah.
What Christian said.
I'm sorry, Tiger. I'm on their side.
The crowd has turned against me. Okay, let's move on.
It's an outstanding question. It's an excellent question.
My point is,
it's an outstanding SmackDown question.
And this is what I'm gonna say. You guys make fun of me, but some hedge fund on Wall Street must have already done that. They must have priced in, made some random predictions and made money out of it. Okay.
The only person Bill Ackman's the only person in the United States that knows who's going to be the president tomorrow. So.
I mean, my point is, sure. 538 will not. The one critique is that if you're a pollster and you incorporate some of those regime-changing events and they don't happen, your reputation will be ruined, right? It will look so bad on you that you predict some wild thing and then nothing happened. However, markets we can talk about this little bit later when we talk about financial markets, economic outlook, but there's a reason why people make money and generate alpha, right? And if you want to make a better prediction than other people, that might be the trend, that you have to incorporate more absurd events in your models. I feel like I'm talking like Alex Jones right now, just rambling.
No. Okay. Let me qualify something that I said a minute ago, which is that I do not think that I'll rephrase my argument. I don't think that for pollsters that this is a possible thing to do in general. I think that when we're talking about global financial markets, that's a different story, because there are hedge funds, right, that are quite capable of assessing, predicting volatility and thus, correcting their models for events like coronavirus, right? Obviously, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I would suspect that the majority of hedge funds that correctly remodeled their portfolios around the incidence of coronavirus started to do so after the first spread into Europe, into the United States, et cetera. I may be wrong about that. However, I think that the difference is that they have an absolutely unthinkably enormous data set to work with. Elections are not that way, right? At the very best, we're dealing with counts in the millions. Hedge funds are dealing with quite a bit more data, I would suspect. But this could be wrong. I'm curious to hear what the more quantitatively minded people have to say.
I'll give a quick example. So Raj Chetty, who is an Indian-American economist at Harvard, one of the most famous economists, Arjun really admires his work. He published some very amazing data on COVID-19 crisis, basically consumer spending, what was happening in each state. He released the whole data set. The whole academic world and students were like, oh, that's an amazing data set. And I talked to a Wall Street chief economist, and he was like, yeah, some hedge fund got that 3 months ago. They've already made money off of it. They've done that. So it seems that if you're in academia, if you're a journalist, you have to do things in a proper way. You have to predict things in a proper way. You have to do it in a way that's not going to ruin your reputation. But my point is, that's not the way how it's going to generate alpha. So what I'm saying is there's a very likely chance that Trump might pull something. Anyways, we don't have to go down this rabbit hole. Maybe we should probably move on to political discourse or something. Arj, do you have any last thoughts on this issue before we move on?
I'm good. I think we should move on.
I do want to talk a little bit about the state of our discourse, because in our promotional poster, forgive pardon my French here, but we were saying that we're a bunch of college kids shooting shit about what the fuck is going on in this country. So we want to figure out what is going on. Again, pardon me. This is a conversation that Arjun and I have been having for a long time. What is the problem on the left? What is the problem on the right? Is America in this kind of great social progress awakening, like someone on the left would say, or are we in decadence, like someone on the right would say, in chaos? So is cancel culture real? Is it a straw man argument? What is going on in this country right now? That's some of the questions that I think I am extremely interested in. I would love to hear you guys' thoughts. What do you think is the state of our social and political discourse right now?
That is a huge question, Tiger. I think we should first try to narrow it down a bit.
By discourse and by social, I mean the kind of norm that dictates how people interact with each other on every day, right? On political issues and how political issues are being talked about in public and in private, right? So podcast hosts would say where some of us are in terrible social chaos and terrible social turmoil, like Ben Shapiro would say. People on the left would say we're in a rapid shift of norms, and we're just trying to grapple with those issues. So the way I would characterize this term discourse would just be the way that dictates how people think and how people interact with each other. Like, for example, if all your friends are posting pictures on Instagram about like becoming vegetarian, or how they're all posting things about liking Joe Biden, that's part of the social discourse that dictates and influences the way you think, right? So
one quick thought on this, and then I'll stop talking because I feel like I've been monologuing a little bit. But in any case, one observation on this would be that I think, Tiger, in direct opposition to what you're suggesting, I would propose that what is happening culturally here is a massive recycling of things that have been trotted out by both parties, by both wings, progressive and conservative, et cetera, for many decades. And part of what occurs to me about this is that, for example, I think the most perhaps viral and aggressive thing that's been happening on social media in recent months, and particularly in the past couple of weeks, has been a massive push towards voting. Bipartisan, in some respects, but I think progressive more often than not. But I think that's very interesting, right? That at perhaps one of the most controversial and one of the most hotly contested political turning points in recent memory, the big kind of rallying cry for progressives has not been, tear the whole thing down, right? It's been in my view a very decisive rejection of hardcore far left progressive policy, right? You see that in the nominee, and in particular, I think you see it in the fact that the rallying cry for this election is get out the vote and not, arrest and impeach Donald Trump or something like that. So I tend to take a very culturally, I guess my approach is to treat everything with a great deal of skepticism. But I think in this case, there's very little new that's happening here in my book.
Yeah, I guess
just ask yourself, in other words, what's one slogan or what's one kind of ideological thing that we are seeing right now in this election that we did not forget about COVID, because that's not really what I'm talking about. But aside from that, culturally, what is one thing that is different in this election than the last?
Dude, I feel like you just asked a question that sounded extremely intelligent, but then Jack and Arjun were just like, we don't know how to answer it, bro. Like, what? This is a hard question, man. What would your answer be? I mean, what?
Let's hear from Jack.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so Chris, correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like you're kind of saying you don't feel that at least the socio-political status in our country has changed too much. It's just things coming up again. If the recycling terms. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I'll refrain from hammering on it because I can think of so many different, for example, with Trump and this sort of campaign slogans, go back to America first, which comes from 1920s, or I don't know if it's the Know Nothing Party or like really, really early stuff, right? It's a historical memory writ large. But anyway, I'll shut up. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I feel like a lot, I'm from a very rural area. Hillary Clinton got in the 20% where I live. And I think this is just obviously one piece of it. We can, cancel culture. I don't really want to. I don't really. We can talk about it later. But for now, I'll just focus on the politics since it is election day. I think there's certainly many ways I think voters in the U.S. are changing their opinions. There was a poll a few days ago, Gallup did, just like a general poll of Americans, and I think 70% of Americans now support legal gay marriage. Now, does that mean 70% of them are, don't think it's weird or something, like, or homophobia or something like that? No, but at the very least, that is a drastic shift within the last 20 years. Likewise, I think, and this is something I think a lot more conservative people like to say, that the kind of realignment we're seeing within political parties, where the Democrats are increasingly becoming, generally, not always, a party that represents non-white voters, educated voters, and high-income voters, and younger women and young voters, whereas the Republican Party is more conservative, both socially and economically, obviously. But now they've increasingly sucked up the kind of, like I mentioned this term earlier, ancestral Democrats, people who 30 years ago, to give an example, in Pennsylvania, if you look at the election map 3 days from now, every county around Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is, will be red, for sure. 30 years ago, 20 years, even in the 2000 election, all the counties around Pittsburgh were blue, because that's where the union workers used to be. That's where the coal miners used to be. They were solid Democrats. They, in the year, I actually read this earlier today, in the year 2000, the Senate candidate for the Democrats in Pennsylvania was anti-abortion. Pennsylvania's had famous Democratic anti-abortion governors like Robert Casey Sr., who Casey v. Planned Parenthood, the famous Supreme Court case about abortion, is named after. So you're seeing kind of, I think, both a cultural shift and kind of it's kind of hard to quantify, but I think generally the trends are views on social issues for Democrats have decidedly moved left, or at the very least, Democratic voters have shifted their own views in response to Democrat. There's a causality argument you can make there about, are voters changing their minds and politicians reflecting it, or have Democratic politicians embraced abortion rights and therefore the Democratic voters have increasingly embraced it? I think to some extent the kind of the culturally, people who used to support Democrats for maybe economic reasons they don't like those as much, whether that's like about guns or immigration, the kind of America First thing you talked about. Why are we focused on a globalization? This is the United States of America. We should, our jobs, my town is getting worse off in, Beaver County, Pennsylvania. Why aren't we focusing on us anymore? Things like that. And also, I think, at least in terms of like kind of radical trends among young voters, at least, I'm sure we all know, or some of us may even be people who consider themselves leftists or have very far left-leaning views, more akin to European style social democracy party, social democrat parties. I think that is not something that has taken the country by and large. I think that's why Bernie Sanders didn't win his nomination. But among young voters, I think for whatever reason, there's an increasing acceptance and belief in social democracy, democratic socialism, and communism, even something like that. But generally, though, much more openness to kind of a very strong welfare state, top-down economy among people our age, at least, who are educated, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. So I was going to add that I think there are ways in which the discourse has shifted. I think that the discourse has shifted substantially. The desires of the electorate have shifted less, in my opinion, a decent amount. So I think, like, when you look at the 2020 Democratic Party, right, Joe Biden is objectively speaking the most progressive candidate in American political history, right? If you just sort of look objectively at the proposals, right, like that. So what
about FDR though? Okay, let's put FDR off the table.
But I guess no. So FDR was. So I guess that's why I'm speaking objectively, right? I'm saying but like it obviously, relative to his time, FDR was probably seemingly more progressive than Biden. But I'm just saying, like, just from an objective perspective, in terms of what we would consider as progressive policies, what FDR has done is pretty much already on the table, guaranteed, not even thought about, and like Biden is pushing even further, right? So that's just what I mean by objective. But I agree that relative to his time, FDR was significantly more progressive candidate. So if you just look at the dialogue of the 2020 Democratic primary, right? Like, I mean, it's unbelievable if you compare this even to like 12 years ago, right? In 2008, right? So Obama's platform was much more moderate, and right, and now you're talking about, like, should we have a public option for healthcare, right? or should we have completely government-run healthcare and abolish the concept of private insurance, right? And that was the main debate with regards to healthcare that was happening in the Democratic primary, right? Now, Biden did win that debate in a sense, although it's hard to say why Biden won, but like one can probably infer that more people might have wanted to keep the private insurance. Who knows, right? But the point is that the goalposts have shifted substantially, where like when you had Obamacare passed, there was like a legitimate debate about whether healthcare is a right or a privilege, right? There's a legitimate debate about like whether you should force insurance companies to protect pre-existing conditions, things like this. And now like that's just pretty much taken for granted, right? So I do think like on the left, with regards to climate, with regards to government intervention in the economy, with regards to healthcare, there is a huge shift in the dialogue of the Democratic Party. And like if you can just look at that by watching the debate on stage, right? And I think similarly in the right, I think the discourse has gone almost even more, like I think we have become more polarized in the sense that like we don't talk as much about sort of middle of the road solutions, right? So I think that like, I mean, in a way, Trump has been a very traditionally conservative president, but the dialogue that's happening on stage in the Republican Party, I think is even more extreme, right? Trump has pushed, like, for example, the dialogue about immigration to a much more extreme version, right? In 2013, you had like bipartisan immigration legislation. Now you're talking about like deporting all illegal immigrants, right? So in for both parties, I think that the dialogue has been pushed far, you know, in a given direction. Now, is that a bad thing? I don't know. Maybe it's a good thing, right? Who knows? But I think that as a result of that, the polarization that has occurred in the discourse has reflected itself in like the discourse of the country as well. And I think that's why we see more polarization than we did before. We have less moderate leaders in power. We have less moderate ideas being talked about, and we have more ideas that are just totally opposed to each other to an extent where it's just hard to find common middle ground. So I think this is one way of maybe thinking about how the discourse has shifted. At the same time, to Christian's point, right, the fact is Biden won, right? Biden was the more moderate candidate in the primary, and he was the one who ended up winning. So the fact is the Democratic electorate is more moderate than like Democratic Twitter, right? So you know, like that's something to keep in mind, is that at least on the Democrat side, people are a little bit more moderate. Now, I don't think that the same thing might be said for the Republican electorate, because Trump is an extreme version. So it's hard to make definitive statements about anything, but the fact is, like, whether or not the electorate is more extreme on either side, it's definitely true that the discourse that's happening both at the party level and, you know, at the level of just people is more polarized than it was before, and that makes it, I think, harder to find middle ground.
Now, Jack, Arjun, Christian, one question I would pose to both of you is that why is that happening in a sense? Because we interviewed a professor, Julian Salazar, who is a very famous politics professor at Princeton, and he wrote this book called Newt Gingrich, basically burning down the house, basically narrating how Newt Gingrich started the hyperpartisanship on Capitol Hill, right? He was the guy who would win at all costs, who would go after people's character just to win a bill. And we're seeing this trend in Mitch McConnell, whatever, which completely made the Republican Party very fierce and brutal and much if more effective and ruthless than their Democratic counterparts. So some would say politicians screwed it up. You know, they're making our social discourse more polarized. Another side would say it's simply because we are at a stage of social progress. It's a great social awakening, for example, right? So we are recognizing issues like racism. We're recognizing issues like climate change. And those are such fundamental issues that if you are not on the same page with me, I just won't talk to you anymore, right? So that's the narrative we constantly hear from our friends on the left, who I often agree in their support with their political views, but they literally say, if you vote for Trump, you are racist, xenophobic, I just don't want to talk to you. If you don't recognize that Black Lives Matter, I just won't talk to you. So one could even say that because we're making such great social progress, and there's just such a great part of a large portion of our population that simply couldn't catch up, and then they should be relegated, they should be, canceled, whatever, and therefore we can't talk to them.
I mean, I think part of, I don't necessarily, putting what you said aside, I think to get at the point you said, why is that polarization among like discussion, talking about issues happening? I don't know. Obviously, I'm not too familiar. I know obviously 1994 Newt Gingrich, the Republican Revolution. I think this is something not really based on too much evidence that I have, but a sort of an intuition. I think, if you look at opinions on a lot of economic issues among Americans, they haven't shifted too much over the past however many years. But people within political parties have become, polarized. And I think part of the reason, and again, this kind of goes back to the causality thing I was mentioning, whether it's, politicians pushing issues and then the voters end up agreeing with them because they already identify with them, or if the people started polarizing themselves and the politicians reflected that. Political parties, the Republican and Democratic parties have very little in common, or very little overlap, I should say. If you think, years ago in the 20th century, at least, there were, the Rockefeller Republicans, right? The liberal Republicans who were pro-choice, who were pro-environmental regulation. And obviously they still had conservative elements in other ways, but there was tons of variation within the party itself. But for one reason or another, voters have started to identify, each party is kind of represented one side of the extreme, right? The Republican Party's platform isn't 80% conservative things and 20%, liberal things or left-leaning things. It's pretty much conservative things. And the Democratic Party's platform is pretty much left-leaning things, liberal things, someone to make leftist things. So I think whether that is the cause or it is a result of polarization, I don't know. But I think at least a trend that you could say is happening is that people in general, especially people who are more politically active, I don't think you can make this claim about people who are less politically involved, but people who are very political to begin with have tended to, their ideals are more aligned with one party or another. So when you're talking with someone who is from another side, who is also very political or has opinions, chances are you're not going to have too much overlap to begin with. And I think that's reflected in kind of the political parties we have today. There's just so few moderate, the last moderate Democrat, that some say, Colin Peterson from Minnesota 7th District. His district was Trump plus 30. He won in 2016 and 2018. He's pro-gun, anti-abortion. He's a very conservative Democrat. He's barely hung on. He's probably going to lose tonight. Kind of the end of an era, the end of a conservative rural Democrat, and they'll be all wiped out. Same, you could say the same about Susan Collins in the Senate. She's looking, who knows what will happen, but a lot of people think she's going to lose her Senate seat as the last kind of moderate Republican in the Senate gone, right? So regardless of why that's happening, I think that's very connected to the point you're making, Tiger.
Arjun, Abe, what do you guys think?
As to your point about polarization, I actually have, it's a thought I'm still working with, but my suspicion is that it doesn't really have much to do with 94, was it Gingrich's revolution, or even a change in the recent push towards progress. I think, for example, if you look at the difference, a couple of years ago, the New York Times had what I thought was a great article talking about polarization. And if you look at the difference between the parties, where they stand between 94 and maybe 2004, 2005, the change actually isn't that much in terms of voting record, which I guess is, I can't say as to rhetorically because I was 6, but in terms of voting record, both parties were still very much on the same page. In fact, there's probably even a little more overlap in 04 compared to 94. Where you really start to see them pull away is around 2013, 2014. So what that makes me think is that it's not so much our positions that have changed, which of course they have. Let us not forget that 10, 12 years ago, even Barack Obama was not in favor of gay marriage. So let's not forget that. Just how far we came. But what really changed around the 2010s was the nature of our discourse. 2010, that was the uprising of Twitter, Facebook, social media. For the first time, that's around the time where our discourse moved primarily onto these platforms. And at that same time, legacy traditional media was their bottom line was being threatened by by this new method of discourse. And I think what you see in response to that is that, unfortunately, a lot of
Abe got cut out. I don't know why. He is one of our callers, by the way, to clarify for some of our listeners and viewers. Abe, you were cut out. You could continue your thoughts.
Where was I?
If you don't even know where you were,
no, I mean, I don't know what I cut out.
It was pretty recently. It was pretty recently. You started talking about social media as the cause, and you're going to that.
Yeah, and in response, like this new form of discourse, this new realm of discourse, really, for the first time, threatened the traditional. I can't think of a better word, but stranglehold that legacy media, like your TV anchors on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, had on but information in general. And I think what you see in the years following that is that in order to compete with social media and these new forms of communication, I think that you've seen more outlets adopt something more approximating the Fox News business model, where you focus in on a demographic and cater to that demographic. Whereas before there was this competition from social media, there was more of an incentive to try to capture as large of an audience, as large and diverse as an audience as possible. But I think, I won't say intentionally, but I think the introduction of social media is what, and the change of the change in the nature of our discourse is what facilitated this polarization. It essentially made it such that everyone was able to form their own echo chambers. And I think a lot of psychological research shows that we unfortunately love like looking at things that make us upset, make us angry. And these echo chambers were already forming online on social media. And a lot of our most prized media institutions and outlets, in order to compete with the new player in the game, kind of came to model that new business model.
Yeah, Arjun, you haven't spoken much about this. Do you have any thoughts on social discourse, where we're at?
Yeah, I think social media has been like a positive and a negative. So I tend to veer towards social media being a negative, and I think the reason is that the hope was that the internet would kind of serve to expose people to different perspectives and kind of allow them to engage with enough of a broad array of opinions that it would actually sort of deconstruct the echo chamber. But I think it's actually contributed to a further echo chamber of so to an extent you can kind of search out what you want to hear, right? And I think people do that actively with regards to news outlets, with regard to consider. Another thing to consider is that, like, I think something like Twitter, where you have 140 characters and things like that, it's not conducive to the kind of discussion that I think is healthy for democracy. Now, how much of that was happening before, I don't know, but I think if you look at the dialogue on Twitter, it's very much like just like strong political opinions and kind of catchy sound bites delivered without.
Arjun, so let me cut you off right there and just ask you a more poignant question. I mean, the way that social media has been involved in influencing elections has been, well documented since 2016. People had a lot of complaints about how fake ads and things like that influenced the outcome there. What are you guys' thoughts on the Hunter Biden story, and then what Facebook and Twitter did to it, for example? So some people would say it wasn't even censorship because you needed to get rid of the misinformation. Some other people would say the Silicon Valley tech giants are obviously liberally biased. What should social media companies do, especially in the election season?
I have one brief thought that I wanted to raise about the prior point before we get into Hunter, and that's an entire can of worms in its own right. But I just wanted to say, Abe, I think that your observation about the social media shift was probably the most, I think, effective characterization that I've heard in recent memory. I mean, I think that really what it highlights effectively is that what we're describing in terms of like norms can easily be conflated with sort of just political headwinds, right? I think that in particular, what we're noticing here with Trump and Biden over the last 4 years is sort of like the needle moving back and forth, the pendulum. But what Abe got at was the fact that like the big shift, or one of the big shifts in terms of general norms and acceptability and so on, was moving the entire scale in a different direction, right? By exposing people to liberal and conservative or leftist and, libertarian ideas, which we're actually now starting to see, I think, very importantly in some congressional races to, right now as we speak. But just the way in which it permitted a variety of views, the so-called Overton window, I think just expanded in both directions in a way that just hasn't been seen before. Echo chambers perhaps are the sort of lighter fluid on top of the fire, if you will, in the sort of communities that form within these groups, say 4chan on the right and the far, sort of QAnon district of the internet, if you will, and then on Twitter, in sort of left Twitter, as it's called. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I think that you all made some very, very, very sharp observations. But the Hunter story, I would be very curious to get people's takes, because I think that there have been some interesting critiques from all around about the sort of decisions made by social media companies, and maybe they had an impossible sort of issue to field with that. But definitely curious to hear your takes.
Honestly, by the way, we should probably move on as wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so, and get about to talking about some new segments going beyond. But we have some other segments prepared for people. Arjun, you got some other thoughts on this issue that
For sure. So with regards to I guess with regards to the Hunter Biden story, social media is a tough job. It's incredibly difficult, just because it's incredibly difficult to like actually. I mean, you can write down a policy for am I going to flag this tweet or ban this tweet, or I'm going to leave it up, right? So that's like the binary decision you're making, right? I think it's impossible to write some sort of policy that can be like implemented in the form of like an algorithm that you can sort of code up, right? That I think it's just impossible. These things are like highly subjective, and I mean that's sort of an obvious statement, right? But that means that the platforms are have to make really tough and subjective decisions that people are naturally not going to like, right? So nobody's going to like.
What do you mean, dude? But you need to have consistent policy, right? That's not very hard, right? For example,
so I think the Hunter Biden story was a mistake, right? Like I don't think that Facebook and Twitter should have banned it. At the same time, so in general, like I think Twitter and Facebook and especially has veered on the line of let's let anything be aired because we're a platform and we shouldn't regulate speech on that platform even if it's like demonstrably false, right? That's the line that they've taken up until like pretty much this year, and that's I kind of disagree with it, but that's a policy that you can take, right? Unless that content is like obviously harmful in a way that like incites severe violence and life-threatening violence against somebody, then you just let it go, right? Like that's a policy that you can very much take, and you can say like if these words appear in the tweet, etc. Right?
Right.
Now, when it comes to like Facebook banning something like, okay, we're going to ban Holocaust denial, we're going to sort of crack down on anti-vaccine things like that. Those seem like socially desirable things to crack down on.
Yes.
But then it's like, I mean, what was the policy, right? You've sort of added, I'm going to add this to the list and say like, this is something we're also going to crack down on, right? You're not saying like, we're going to crack down on this because of X, Y, Z, right? And because of X, Y, Z, we can also crack down on the other things. I don't know if you can say that in a way that's like, allows for a consistent policy. So the Hunter Biden thing was a mistake. I don't think that they should have stopped it. I think it had something to do with like it being, I think the FBI flagged it, told them that it might be Russian disinformation. I think there was something about that which was why they stopped it. They shouldn't have, but I have no answer for how social media companies should do this. I really don't know. So like yeah, I mean, I'm not really saying much here, but it's just an incredibly difficult problem, and you're going to make anybody unhappy. So I really don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to offer some concluding thoughts. I mean, I think Abe brought up a wonderful theme for that we did not previously prepare, which is social media. I'm not very optimistic in that regard because social media, as Abe said, putting people into echo chambers. But I would also add to the fact that you can find any facts on there, right? I mean, superior facts, inferior facts, good facts, bad facts, wrong facts. You can all find it there. And that's it. That's where you pick your fights and get your information. So I just don't see how partisan problems can be solved because that's how. And but also get back to your question, Arjun. I do think there are consistent policies that you could very much try. For example, you wouldn't review or flag something unless maybe it's getting to 100,000 people, or you could say we ban. Most of the foreign intelligence fed information, such as the Hunter Biden story, which you could very validly make that point, but it's just that Facebook. Well, also everybody hates Facebook. Twitter is less so, but it's just a very tricky situation. But I don't think just saying it's a tough question gives them a cop out, right? I mean, you should say we are not just platforms. We're media companies. We do some censoring and editorializing, which is acceptable. New York Times does that. Fox News does that. That's fine as long as you.
No, but I think there's a difference, right? You can't say that if you do any sort of censorship or any sort of regulation of content, then suddenly you become a media company, right? I think that's a dangerous thing. When you're a media company, you are producing content, right? And you're putting out that content, and that content usually has an ideological bias. When you're a platform, you're allowing anybody to put content that could express any sort of ideology. All Facebook and Twitter are trying to do is try to say there are certain types of content that are so outside the pale, so beyond the pale, that we have to get rid of it. As to exactly how you make those decisions, as you suggested, sure, those are concrete steps that you can take. But when it comes to it's a difficult issue, right? So I mean, I was interning at Google last summer, and somebody from YouTube came and talked about how they were trying to police content on YouTube because it's kind of a gateway to extremism for a lot of people. And they said okay, well, so if a far right politician says something horrific like immigrants are less than human and they're coming to infest this country or something like that evokes extremely sort of derogatory and kind of almost inhuman language against a group of people, is that something that you get rid of, or is that something that you actually keep because that perspective kind of needs to be out there for
First Amendment, whatever, up for debate?
So I don't know, right? So yeah. In that case, right, maybe I would veer on the side of you keep that content and voters see it and make their judgment on it rather than get rid of it. So then where exactly does that line fall?
Wrong.
I don't know whether you can create it. You're going to have contradictions in any policy, I think. So yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know how Facebook and Twitter exactly do it, but it seems to me that it's impossible to write an algorithm for it.
I disagree with that. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, I agree with you, Arjun, in that, yes, the problem is a very difficult one on how to solve it. But I think the fundamental problem we're getting at is that just in the last 10 years, Facebook, Twitter, social media have essentially become the equivalent of the public square, but they are also private companies. So I think, for example, within the Hunter Biden story, I think the crux of the issue is that there was supposedly a neutral principle applied to stop the story. I know with Twitter, they said it was their hacked material policy / potential Russian foreign disinformation or what was it? I can't remember the third thing, but that was a little questionable. Well, extremely questionable, because if you were to truly apply that neutral principle, for example, then they should have banned the New York Times account for publishing Trump's tax returns, because that would be considered personal material or hacked material, because they presumably would have slowed the dissemination of Edward Snowden's whistleblower report. So it's not that I don't think that the problem that we're dealing with right now is that the neutral principles that we're applying are bad necessarily. And just as a side note, I do believe that they're bad. I think we shouldn't, they shouldn't have the power to determine like what information people see, because they're not elected. But it's not that there are neutral principles. It's that these are neutral principles, quote unquote, that aren't applied neutrally. And it seems like as if so far, when they're unevenly applied, they have very real and consistent political ramifications. And it just so happened in this case that there was kind of a Streisand effect, and it kind of backfired on their intended effect. But like, I am empathetic to how difficult of an issue this is. I don't envy the position that these companies are in.
I think you raised an interesting point about the consistency of response, which is sort of what you're hinting at, that we're seeing an inconsistent response, which therefore leads to a sense of like a lack of transparency. And I wonder what you think about, you know, the future of these social media companies as a source of reliable and trustworthy information.
Well, that's, I think the core of it is, one, these companies aren't really sources of information. If you think about it, they are merely platforms that connect you to sources of information. So I know that's, I'm sorry, could you ask the question again? I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly before we move on to the energy segment, I guess I was wondering, since, you know, you mentioned the New York Times articles and all these other sort of media outlets that use social media to get their information across, and I know a lot of people get their news from social media to begin with. I think the point I was just trying to make is that your point about the lack of consistency about you know, social media companies' responses to these posts, I think leads to a big transparency, which, you know, could hint at a longer term trend of more distrust of news found on social media.
Yeah. And I think that lack of transparency in how these companies choose to what information is disseminated, the way their algorithms work on like who gets promoted, who gets, I don't know, there's like controversial takes on like people getting shadow banned and whatnot. I think that it's a huge gray area, but I think ultimately the way out of it to increase trust in not just these companies, but just information in general. Because honestly, if you want to find something, you can find it, anything, if you look hard enough. I think the way to increase public trust of these companies and just information in general is through transparency of decision-making behind subduing a story, preventing its dissemination, or the way algorithms work. And right now, these are very closely guarded secrets. It's a pretty opaque process, and nobody knows how like the YouTube algorithm works or the Twitter algorithm works. And I feel like that's the only way out of this.
Arjun, you got any concluding thoughts before you have to go soon?
Yeah, I'm going to head out. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have too much to add from what I was saying. I just, yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue that these principles are not being applied consistently. I tend to be skeptical that there's like a strong liberal bias within these networks, within these companies, in terms of how they enforce policies. Like, I mean, a lot of this seems to be like innuendo and insinuation, because the fact is that most employees who work at the companies are Democrats. Like, I don't think that seems to be like a common argument that's kind of made to insinuate that there's bias. But it is possible that at least, I mean, look at the Hunter Biden case. It's maybe true that the rules are potentially not being equally enforced. But again, I mean, I wish I was more informed on Facebook's and Twitter's actual policies. The really all I can kind of do is just say, like, when it comes to like hard policies, you can say something like, okay, well, ban harmful content if it exceeds a certain threshold. Twitter is trying to like discourage retweets before you before you actually read the tweet and putting warnings there, things like that. I think those are good things, right? Like that, those are things that are trying to encourage a little bit more informed discourse. But when it comes to actually policing content, right, it's just somebody's going to be unhappy somewhere. So that's what I would kind of say. I got to head out after this. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining, Arjun. If we're gonna let Owen take over in a sec to talk about some climate change, Biden's clean energy plan. It's also 9:30. We want to give a quick shout out to our official partner, the Princeton's Whit Clio Society. They have an election party tonight at 9:30 that you should totally go check out. They have raffles, they have game night, they have discussions of students about what is going on. Go check it out. Come back here or stay there. Very, very good event over there as well. If you want to take a break from the intense policy punchline discussion we got going on here, right? But Owen and I will talk a little bit more about climate change. Obviously, Sully, Abe, Christian, Rupa will also be around, and we'll all be here. So. Yes, Owen, we'll let you take over.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. And like Tiger said, anyone who wants to jump in here, please feel free to do so, because I feel like that would make this would make this more fun. But just thinking about this, so in my view, this is probably the most important election for energy and climate. It's definitely the election where energy has gotten the most amount of attention since probably 1980. In the race between Reagan and Carter. Back then, we obviously had Carter dealing with some OPEC issues and the energy crisis that emerged in 1979, but now a completely different scenario. We have a challenger, Joe Biden, who has essentially made his a large portion of his campaign on energy and climate change. And it's a fairly radical plan that he's presenting. And it's not radical in the sense that it's unachievable or it's something that hasn't been done before by other countries, but it's definitely radical in terms of the steps that he's suggesting that the U.S. should take. And so, I think that it's very reasonable to think through kind of first what has gone on the past 4 years with Trump, what he's proposing for the next few years, and then also thinking through what a Biden presidency might look like. And I also have some thoughts on some down ballot races. Stuff like that's going on. So if no one wants to comment, first going to talk a little bit about Trump. So the past 4 years has been, I would say, like a conservative dream as far as what Trump has done for energy and the environment. And that's as far as you can kind of boil down his plan to two words, and that's regulatory rollbacks. So for the past 4 years, Trump has really been trying to roll back regulations in both the energy, in terms of he's trying to roll back parts of the Clean Power Plan. He's obviously intending to leave the Paris Climate Agreement, which would have had pretty substantial impact on how America interacts both globally and also with its own energy resources. He's suppressed DOE reports on clean energy and the grid. He's repeatedly announced his opposition to mercury and air toxic standards, as well as methane standards. But also, interestingly, he's touted a bit of an environmentalist record in the months leading up to the election. He signed the Great American Outdoors Act, which promises billions of dollars over several years to help bolster public lands, state parks, national forests. And then he's also created a offshore drilling moratorium for some Atlantic states, which already existed beforehand, so he didn't do that much. But he has been talking about that on the campaign trail, which is pretty interesting. So overall, he's definitely been a huge ally to the oil and gas industry. He's vocally been an ally to that industry, and he's also vocally been an ally to the coal industry and other fossil fuel sources. But I would say that renewable private companies have done pretty well in the past 4 years. And also a lot of states have taken big steps in terms of clean energy, in terms of renewable energy. But the two most prolific examples of private American companies doing well on the renewable side is probably Tesla, which dominates headlines as market cap is through the roof. And then also the Next Era Energy, which is experiencing, I believe is one of the largest energy companies in the world right now, and is also the largest renewable company, and also has done very well in the stock market. So those are the two things that have most frequently been in the headlines as far as the renewable side of things over the past couple of years. And definitely there are people who would say that it's been a huge failure. But private companies wise, there are some serious private companies that have taken huge steps and are leading the way. So also it'd be informative to kind of talk about what Joe Biden's plan is. I mentioned before it's ambitious and it's radical in some ways. So what exactly is he doing here? So he's kind of taking the lead of where the Democratic primary was heading. We had a pretty substantial portion of the Democratic primary focused on climate change. That included obviously Governor Jay Inslee, who joined on basically only a climate change platform, which was pretty crazy. But also he took a lot of policy ideas from Senator Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, Senator Bernie Sanders, and kind of incorporated it into his own. And I would say that kind of the stimulus for all this can be drawn back to the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Edward Markey putting that out there. It was widely criticized at the time, but it also kind of ignited this newfound enthusiasm for a concept that has grown in size and scope, but environmental justice and things relating to the social justice aspects of energy and climate. So that's a pretty big piece and pretty big precursor to the Joe Biden clean energy plan. So it's a 22-page plan, calls for $2 trillion in spending over 4 years. It's been widely criticized by Trump and others as like hoax money going into nowhere. But it sounds like he has a pretty good idea of where he'd want it to go. He wants to achieve economy-wide net zero emissions no later than 2050. He focuses throughout his like 22 pages on environmental justice, trying to pull some of the folks who might have been left behind in the fossil fuel era to an equitable future. And he talks about all this in a way where he doesn't really emphasize or need Congress, which is pretty interesting. He's really strongly promoting the idea of executive action to reach a lot of these ambitious goals. And frankly, I feel like he thinks that that's a way to get around a potentially Republican Senate, which is somewhat likely to continue existing. So,
and just to quickly follow up on that part about the Republican Senate part, what do you think is really holding back in terms of climate change progress right now? I mean, it seems that the Republican Party has been very reluctant to recognize any of the climate change actions. I mean, the issue is there are good policies being proposed that even in conservative policy sides of things, right? If you trust free markets, you can simply levy a carbon tax or something that would be in the traditional line of conservative economic policy thinking and still address climate change. But it seems that we're not even getting there. So my quick question, two questions for you and also Sully and Rupa, anyone want to jump in? First one is, who's really holding up the progress? Because it seems that, even centrist Democrats don't like something like the Green New Deal, which might be something we do need in order to address climate change. So who is holding up the progress? So I guess that is the main thing. And second of all, if we were to make progress, doesn't mean it has to be done in a partisan, hyper-partisan fashion, meaning without Republican Party shoveling down something down their throats, just passing something that is single partisan.
Yes, I mean, I absolutely don't think that. I'll try to answer those questions in order. First of all, I think a lot of what's holding us back is if you think through the legislative process and how that works. So you have a Democratic Senate, a Democratic Congress, a Democratic House that has in some
in some ways succeeded in passing clean energy legislation. In other ways have failed dramatically. As you mentioned, there's conservative or moderate members of the House from places like Detroit, where there's huge auto manufacturing. There's obviously Democratic congressmen from all sorts of red areas in Texas and Oklahoma and places like that, where they're not going to come out and necessarily bash on the oil and gas industry or super aggressively tout their clean energy credentials because it would hurt them politically. So obviously there are centrist Democrats and conservative Democrats even who are against this type of legislation. But I think overall the Democratic side of it is much more likely to pass this legislation in the future, and anyone who doesn't think so is pretty crazy. But all right, if we get past the centrist and conservative Democrats in the House, we go to the Senate, controlled by Mitch McConnell, which is in Kentucky, one of the largest coal states in the country, still producing a lot of coal. A lot of federal funding has gone into coal over the past few years in terms of what we're going to do with it in the future as it gets less and less competitive as a power source, which I think is pretty interesting. But for right now, they're pretty set on grasping the last few years of coal as a power source, as and the next few decades of fossil fuels as a whole as power producing entities. But I think it's important to consider who's at the top, and that's Mitch McConnell. There's a lot of other really conservative members who would want nothing to do with climate change, but there's also a decent amount of members who have shown a willingness to negotiate on these subjects. You had a bill that was almost passed in 2009, 2010 under Obama, where Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina was supposed to be the Republican kind of lead on that part. He ended up flaking pretty hard, and a lot of Democrats really don't like him because of that. Unfortunately, I still think he's going to be Jamie Harrison, but that's neither here nor there. But there are senators, the senator from Maine, just out of necessity, Miss Collins or Senator Collins needs to support some type of climate change and green legislation in order for her constituents to be happy. You can argue that the senator from Alaska, Murkowski, who's the head of the energy and climate change, is probably going to be in a scenario where she's a pivotal vote, would probably need to vote for a climate change or a green energy scenario. I think what's holding it up here is Mitch McConnell and a lot of these committees are strategically not allowing votes because they realize that when it comes to a vote, a lot of their members are going to need to see the tides of public opinion and probably vote against what the party heads would like them to do. And then obviously at the top of the ticket, you have Trump. So in a scenario where the Democrats after tonight or after this week, I don't know how that works, control the House and the Senate, you obviously have to pass something that Trump is going to sign. And so that's going to be difficult unless they can tie it to things that they know he'll sign. So those are kind of the main roadblocks there. And I talked a long time about that. So what was your second question?
My second question would be, which I think you already addressed, which is that in order to make progress for climate change, do we need to be hyper-partisan? And I think this is an open question beyond climate, and I think a good transition to our next segment about healthcare and stuff. But I want to make this an open-ended question, which is that in order for radical solutions, great social progress to happen, such as the Green New Deal, such as progressive taxation, such as drastically reducing inequality, universal health care, all those initiatives, does that mean it can only come from the Democrats? And I don't mean to ask this in such a partisan way, but it seems that they are the ones that are proposing the more radical solutions.
I mean, I would say on the energy and climate side, it's definitely going to stem from Democratic leadership. But I wouldn't say that it's going to not be a bipartisan solution. Like, I think in a lot of, you can look at a lot of states, for example, there have been clean energy initiatives that have gotten strong bipartisan support in several different states. There's a lot of Democrats who are on the other side of the table, as you mentioned earlier, Tiger. There's a lot of conservative and moderate Democrats who are on the other side of the table in these equations, who are pushing back against these conversations. I think it's not necessarily like red or blue down at that level, but as you go further up, it does get more partisan, and as things like committee chairs and obviously the head of the majority chair of the Senate, like that stuff really matters, and so the fact that it's not even being brought to a vote, a lot of these issues, is important. Alexander?
Yeah, one thing I'll say on that is that a lot of it also has to do with the, I guess, Republican prioritization of corporations and like deregulation because of like money stuff. And so I guess convincing people of the necessity of climate change policy is one thing, but convincing people of like the profitability of climate change policy is potentially a route that centrists might see as like a way to get Republicans on their side. Now, whether that's naive of somebody like Joe Biden to say, you know, we can get Republican support on this, I think he thinks it's possible, but it seems like there's a lot of pure obstructionism for its own sake.
Yeah, I think Tiger's question, I like appreciate the premise, but I think it's a little different with climate change, because climate change is extremely time sensitive in a way that no other issue is, because the situation just gets worse exponentially with time. So I think that there's a lot of fossil fuel money exerting pressure on Republicans, and that kind of limits them, because there are a lot of young Republicans who say, hey, the party needs to act more on climate change. And like, frankly, to Alexandra's point, like acting sustainably is more profitable just from like a business point of view. Like solar energy is simply cheaper now.
Well,
and I think a lot of this stuff, what?
Especially in the long run, because
exactly. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so I think the fossil fuel money is kind of holding Republicans back, and time is kind of pushing Democrats forward. And so I think a partisan solution is required on climate change in a way that it isn't quite true for most other issues.
I'm not so sure if that's the case. I'll slightly disagree with that, because at the end of the day, I think Republicans like clean air and water too. I think what makes the issue so partisan first is, as Owen already pointed out, there are a lot of states that we're doing this in the backdrop against the backdrop of a number of states being primarily dependent on the energy industry to keep them afloat for tax revenue and just quality of life, and against the backdrop of foreign policy, energy independence from the Middle East, Russia, et cetera, et cetera. I think where it starts to get a little partisan, for example, is like within the Green New Deal. I know that it spurred a lot of discussion around renewed discussion of climate policy, but within the new Green New Deal, there are parts of it that just have nothing to do with climate policy and instead start to deal with social policy. And I'll say, I think it's unforgivable that as the Republican Party at the highest levels just does not acknowledge climate change. But even so, with that, I think the discussion on how to combat climate change is the proposed solutions are also a little divisive. For example, we're looking at increased energy demands in the coming decades, but in such a way that wind and solar, I don't think will ever meet. So long term, it looks like the only feasible solution to produce as much energy as we need and stay independent would be nuclear. But nuclear doesn't seem to be something that's discussed. The majority of the conversation seems to revolve around wind and solar, which like if you look at California, they like this past summer, they've had rolling blackouts because they shut down so many of their natural gas plants. And at peak demand, they just did not have enough power in the middle of the summer. So as far as, and I understand climate change is a time-sensitive issue, but as far as the coming decades goes, it looks like what's going to end up being the case, or the most feasible solution in my mind that I see, is that complete transition to natural gas from coal in the short run, because in the past few years, that transition is what has cut down our emissions like so much. That's why we're the number one reducer of emissions in the world at the moment. But long term, it seems like the transition needs to be made to nuclear.
Right.
I may be wrong here, but I do not think that California had rolling blackouts due to a lack of energy. In fact, they have to unplug a lot of their solar arrays because they generate too much energy in the summer. They have rolling blackouts because of climate change exacerbating forest fires. That's why they have rolling blackouts. In fact, yeah.
Sorry, just to provide some more context there. Yeah, so I think you incidentally touched on 2 points that are conservative talking points against solar and wind.
Yeah. Let's not go down this rabbit hole.
Yes. So the issue with California's grid, there's a lot of different issues happening with it, but they don't have the demand response necessary to keep up with the different influxes of electricity needed. So it is true that the solar and wind couldn't meet the needs of the California electricity grid at the times of a lot of those blackouts. And it's also very true that those were the electricity needs were exacerbated because of the air conditioning needs and other needs of houses that were due in some part to climate change. But I would say that the point about solar being taken off the grid has been like a pretty strong conservative talking point, in terms of like, when we don't need solar, we're essentially just wasting money, is their talking point, which is not necessarily true, because the marginal cost of solar is zero. But it's important to consider that, like, when you're curtailing a large amount of energy at any point, it's not necessarily the most economical choice for ratepayers. And it's one thing that people are jumping on, in terms of like, solar and wind do at times produce energy when we don't need them, and oftentimes don't produce energy when we do need them. So these are two big issues that there's several technologies in the works that can help solve this. But wind and solar alone, as Abe's kind of talking about, have run into issues, and in California especially, have come under scrutiny for their lack of being able to meet the needs of all the utility ratepayers in California.
Oh, and you got some final thoughts? Let's not go down the rabbit hole on this one particular solar. You may listen to our most recent interview with Tom Layden on it. So if you're interested. So
yeah, one thing that I would say is that, like, because America doesn't have one central grid, because it doesn't have one utility controlling everything that's going on, states actually have a ton of power. So one interesting thing to watch out for, and as we've been talking about, like, California, as far as the energy transition goes, is absolutely leading the way. Other states in the West are falling behind pretty aggressively, but Texas is another leader. North Carolina is another leader. Colorado is an example of a leader. But the clean energy legislation at this point is coming a lot from the state. So pay attention to local elections tonight. See what's going on with a lot of public utilities are having commission elections in, I think, like 10 different states. So there's a lot to look at beyond just the presidential election, beyond the national elections. But especially for energy and the environment, states can make a huge difference. So it's my signing off point. Thank you, Tiger.
Thanks so much, Owen, for joining us. Next up, we got public health and healthcare, the future of Obamacare. We're going to talk about mass vaccination policy, things like that. Alex Wilson is here. She just graduated last year from Princeton, founded our healthcare segment on Policy Punchline. And then we have Trisha who is a freshman just joining us. So we have two very well-versed, knowledgeable ladies to help present and lead this segment. You guys want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. So Trisha's going to go first, and then I think Rupa is also going to pitch in on healthcare as well.
Yeah, sounds good. So we just wanted to give a little bit of context, I guess, starting with Obamacare and then dive into the candidates' healthcare plans. And then maybe after we can talk about COVID and vaccinations. I guess we can start with Obamacare and what that did the first time around, because so much of Biden's healthcare plan is based off of that. So, I mean, the ACA was, first of all, really successful in doing what it aimed to do and increasing the number of uninsured people in the U.S. The amount of uninsured people fell from 17% to 10% between 2013 and 2016. But we also saw a lot of trade-offs there. So as coverage increased, we saw affordability for people who weren't getting those subsidies decreasing. So we saw, for example, soaring premiums. Average premiums for people, for middle-aged people on mid-level plans almost doubled in the past 6 years. We saw a lack of regulation regarding deductibles and prescription drug costs, which resulted in both skyrocketing. And of course, that resulted in high out-of-pocket costs, which led some insured patients to visit the doctor even less because they weren't able to get discounts that doctors would usually give to patients who didn't have coverage. So those are a couple of the areas where the ACA didn't succeed, and we can now, I guess, go into the other healthcare plans to see if they'll address any of these issues. So.
Yeah, exactly. I will also briefly say, I mean, when you poll people about what they like or don't like about Obamacare, premiums and deductibles are always, obviously the thorn in the side of the ACA, and people are consistently paying a lot out of pocket for care.
Yeah, exactly. And so starting, I guess, with Trump's healthcare plan. So the main thing that we've seen for his healthcare stance is that the administration doesn't support the ACA. And I think, Alexandra, you're going to go into that a little deeper about how they're currently fighting a lawsuit in the Supreme Court about the constitutionality of that. But some things that both candidates do agree on is our prescription drug reforms. As I mentioned earlier, those have been skyrocketing. And also an end to surprise billing. But in the past couple of years, Congress hasn't really been successful at passing any legislation regarding either of those. And then I guess we can go into like a broad overview of Biden's healthcare plan. Yeah. So the two main parts of the healthcare plan are, one, offering a public option, and then two, improving the quality of care for people who are already covered by the insurance policies. So the public option is different from Medicare for All because Medicare for All would eliminate commercial insurance, but a public option would simply allow people to choose. And as Alexandra mentioned, premiums have been skyrocketing, and it doesn't seem like that's going to end soon. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services estimated that over the next 8 years, premiums will grow by 40%. So the Harvard Business Review explains that a well-executed public option could actually succeed where Medicare didn't, and offer competitive, accessible plans to drive down the prices of private insurances and premiums. And then on the other side of things, in improving quality of care, under improving quality of care, the Biden healthcare plan would shift all the plans from silver to gold, which means that they would, instead of getting 70% coverage by insurance, they would get 80%, which would then reduce deductibles and copays. Something else that the plan proposes is eliminating the subsidy cap. So currently, the people who are covered by the insurance policies or by ACA would pay up to 9.85% of their annual income, but he proposes shifting it to no more than 8.5% of the annual income. And because premiums have just skyrocketed, this is really crucial for the millions of Americans who are above 400% of the poverty level, which means that they're not covered by subsidies currently. But a lot of them are still, millions of them are still unable to afford coverage. Another part of the plan for improving quality of care would be lowering the Medicare age to 60. A couple of things that this would do would be, one, it would stress a Medicare system that's pretty much already at capacity unless unless there's some sort of action in the next couple of years, they're going to like be really stressed for funding. And that part of the plan wouldn't be supported by people, for example, who are already on Medicare or close to it, because it would dilute the amount of coverage that those beneficiaries already have. And of course, increasing the amount of people who are on Medicare, which reimburses less than commercial insurance, would mean that hospitals and private practices would also be particularly hard hit. But those last couple of proposals on improving quality of care are mostly achievable through budget reconciliation, which makes them a lot more likely than, for example, offering the public option, because that can happen without ending the filibuster.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was a super great overview. I think that it hits, some of the most important aspects of Biden's plan, which, you talked about the public option and you talked about the changing subsidies or expanding subsidies. Did you mention it's a little bit wonky, but the gold and silver plans? I don't know.
Right. So I think that switching from silver to gold would just increase the amount of coverage that they have. So that would decrease the amount of like out of pocket that patients have to pay.
Yeah. Okay. Rupa, did you want to go? I didn't know which parts you wanted to hit, and then I can sort of.
Yeah, sure. I can talk a little bit about sort of the future of Obamacare, where we're sort of headed with the Supreme Court, because we know that they're scheduled to hear the Affordable Care Act case next week. There's been a lot of turmoil because of RGB's death, and a lot of Democrats, especially Nancy Pelosi, really attribute the rush to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to striking down the ACA. So for a brief, legal history, in 2018, a lot of Republican lawyers argued that a specific tax cut law made the Obamacare Act unconstitutional by reducing the penalty for not having insurance to zero. So basically, the penalty for not having insurance was constitutionally allowed. However, because it is now zero, that is what makes this act unconstitutional. There is, however, general consensus among both liberal and conservative lawyers that it doesn't make sense for the entire Obamacare Act to fall, just specifically because it works against sort of the legislative mechanisms of reform we see through Congress. In 2015, the act was also challenged, but it was upheld because of Roberts and Kennedy. But without RGB, this case could end up in a 4 tie, which means that the lower court ruling stands. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the consequences of eliminating this act, and it sort of hits in two main categories. The first is patients, and the second is insurance companies, doctors, and more like institutional things. In terms of patients, if this act is fully, struck down in court, more than 20 million Americans who currently buy insurance through the ACA marketplace or have Medicaid might lose their health insurance right away. And it's pretty likely this number is even higher since the enrollment rates have gone up since COVID, and more than 14 million people have lost their jobs in August, meaning that people might lose their health insurance with their jobs as well. Some specific changes you might see is that children under 26 are no longer guaranteed to remain on their parents' health plan. Some Medicaid patients might lose enhanced prescription drugs, as Trisha mentioned earlier, and women might lose access to free birth control. I think sort of the more interesting things that we see are the institutional changes, because we're looking at insurance companies, doctors, hospitals, and drug companies have sort of all changed the way they operate right now based on the rules of the game. And the game is now the Obamacare Act. If you sort of just strike this down right away, you're completely wiping away these major rules, which leaves, in my opinion, complete utter chaos in terms of what kinds of regulation, what sort of methods should be used by insurance companies. And you're completely stripping away some of the most foundational tenets of the system. The Obamacare Act instituted banning, they banned the fact that you could base coverage based on health history. They and the fact that you could cap individual benefits. However, if the system's rolled back, there's a potential we're going to see that coming back very quickly in sort of the insurance area. I'm not sure if you want to add some more on about this, Alex.
Yeah, sure. So one thing that I really want to stress about the court challenge to the ACA is that it is, I would say the majority of legal scholars commentating on this in the media find this to be I would use as strong a word as ridiculous as a challenge. So the entire challenge to the ACA rests on this idea of the individual mandate. And the individual mandate, as Rupa mentioned, was declared constitutional as a taxing power. So you're taxing people for not having health insurance. And right now, when you fill out your IRS forms, you still have to mark whether you have health insurance or not. And you are still taxed, but you're taxed $0. And so what these lawyers are arguing is that a $0 tax isn't a tax. And thus, the individual mandate is unconstitutional. As Rupa said, striking the individual mandate down as unconstitutional, while not incredibly likely, is possible, but the entirety of the ACA shouldn't have to fall with the individual mandate. So when Obamacare was passed, there was a lot of discussion of Obamacare as what's called a three-legged stool. So you need three things in order to have a functioning Obamacare marketplace. Those three things are a ban on denying people with pre-existing conditions from getting healthcare. So anybody can enter this marketplace. But to balance those people out, you need young, healthy people in the marketplace. So there's an individual mandate sort of compelling people, you must have health insurance. And then tying all of that together are these subsidies saying, okay, you're young, healthy, and you don't have a lot of money, so we'll help you pay for this health insurance. And they basically said, this act, this Obamacare, is going to fail without all three of these things. Well, we haven't had an individual mandate for 3 years. It was set to 0 in 2017. And Obamacare seems to be doing fine. It doesn't have quite the high approval that we thought it would. It's sitting somewhere around 50%, 51, 52 overall. But it's doing well. People are signing up for it. And we haven't seen these huge pools of, very old or very sick people entering into the marketplace. So arguing that, the entire act is unconstitutional if this one piece of it is, when this one piece of it hasn't had any teeth for years, I think people do see that as, an argument that the court might not hear out for very long. There is a chance that the court could just dismiss it outright. But we'll have to see. I mean, having a 6-3 conservative majority does make a difference, and it could mean that these cases that seem very cut and dried become in play all of a sudden.
Yeah, go ahead, Tiger.
Sorry, just to quickly add on to the point about public options and also the ACA. What about expanding Medicare? I mean, that is an idea that. So I was at this House Policy Conference hosted by Princeton Center for Wellbeing and the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies, and we talked. Some of the professors mentioned how you can simply expand the Medicare by lowering the eligibility age from 65 to 60. Mm-hmm. And this is something that seniors will like, they will accept, AARP will not oppose, and this direction of Medicare expansion will probably eventually probably go down to 50 or something. And this might be a little bit fiscally a little bit more burdensome to public finance, but in general for the economy it will be cheaper, right? Because you will be taking them on rather than this will save money for the economy for sure. And if we manage them prudently, this is absolutely manageable fiscally. So that could be an alternative, that a moderate alternative that both parties could accept, you think?
I don't know about both parties accepting it. One thing I didn't know that Trisha actually just mentioned was that expanding that eligible pool for Medicare would stress, this system that already is fairly overburdened. I didn't realize that actually, and I'm not sure, when you say overburdened, whether that's hospitals or physicians or like money, like actual pool of money that's available. What I do know is that healthcare delivered through Medicare and Medicaid, because it has this like bargaining power of the government involved, is able to deliver cheaper care. You're able to barter for drugs in a way that insurance companies aren't. And at least I'm pretty sure, yes, there is bargaining power that the federal government has, yes, with drug companies. And I think that's something that has been and could be put into play for the public option, where you could say, this public option insurance, we're opening it up so that we can use this bargaining power of the government to make the public option deliver cheaper care as well. Right? Because the public option is healthcare from the government, we could make that healthcare have the same bargaining power that Medicare and Medicaid do and deliver that care at a cheaper cost because of that. So one thing to answer your question of like whether this is feasible like in a bipartisan way, it really doesn't seem like there is any Republican support for a healthcare plan. I mean, they couldn't get repeal and replace together.
Right. Tough.
So I only see obstructionism, and I mean, if that changed, that would be amazing, I think.
So what do you guys think is the Republican vision for healthcare then? Is there, or in other words, do you think universal healthcare is the left's vision?
Yes, I think, like, to be really honest, yeah, I think that every single time that Donald Trump and Mike Pence get on a stage and say they have a plan to cover people with pre-existing conditions, they're lying, because if they have a plan, why wouldn't they share it? If they have a back pocket plan, nobody knows about it. And I don't think you can say that they have a plan to cover everybody when lawyers pushing to repeal the ACA. I mean, Rupa just told us how many people would go uncovered in that situation, and it's 20 million people lose health insurance, right away.
And that is honestly one reason why I think the Supreme Court wouldn't do it, because the Supreme Court is already facing huge a burden in terms of public trust, right? I mean, especially after, yeah. and if you do something that takes away 21 million people's health insurance, it doesn't matter whether it's constitutional or whatever. I mean, it will be a public outcry to your credibility. So
yeah, I mean, out of everything in the health insurance space, giving care to people with pre-existing conditions, I mean, no, like, everybody wants this. You can't ask somebody like, should this like sickly person receive care? And you just don't get that many people saying no.
So let me ask you guys this then. Do you personally support universal healthcare? Something like single payer, Bernie Sanders plan, whatever his plan is. Honestly, whenever I ask a health economist, they always say, we don't even know what Bernie Sanders plan is. It seems that most of the health economists I've talked to support public option rather than Bernie Sanders plan. And this is
unfortunate. I mean, I do think it's unfortunate that we can really say we haven't had the chance to get quite that far yet into the debate. Like, when you say we don't know what that is, I think to some extent that's true. When you say Medicare for all, there's a lot of things that could mean, like a lot of things. And I think that Joe Biden's plan currently is a combination of being feasible with some really hard work, and also probably the most progressive ideas that we've seen floated at a national level that are feasible.
Okay, I think that's a good way to to look at things. I mean, perhaps maybe we can talk a little bit more about public health policies going forward. Just basically what is really going on here. Are you guys optimistic about vaccines? I'm just trying to get a sense of the room.
Well, I was until you sent your email.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that if you want, Alex.
Please, Rupa.
Yeah, please. I mean, sure. Just like briefly, I can start with what a vaccine is. And usually a vaccine requires years and years of research. Obviously, given coronavirus, we've been trying to get a vaccine done in the next year. 50 are currently being tested on humans, and 10 are now in the final stages. So there's usually 3 phases for vaccine testing. They've been combining phases for testing in the past year. There are, I think, 5 or 6 main types of vaccines. They're genetic, viral vector, protein-based, attenuated, and repurposed vaccines, just to give you a high-level overview. So the real question that we're facing today is how effective is the vaccine? Usually FDA sets a benchmark for the efficacy, but contrary to typical safety thresholds, the benchmark is not particularly high for the coronavirus vaccine. The FDA, for instance, has set this threshold at 50%, which would be in the same ballpark as the flu vaccines in most years. And it usually would be pretty useful for a vaccine, but it would come nowhere as close to the efficacy of vaccines that have effectively eradicated other viruses such as the measles. So if preliminary results suggested that 70% efficacy or higher, however, a vaccine could come close to becoming, truly game changing. There's been a lot of talk around herd immunity. However, given sort of Tiger's email, I think there's a very little chance that that's actually going to happen. We know that the natural transmission rate is around 2.5%. So just doing a little bit of math here, if a vaccine had 100% efficacy, that would require that 60% of the population is vaccinated. If the efficacy was 75%, the herd immunity would require an 80% vaccination coverage. However, we know that the FDA set it at 50% efficacy, which means that the herd immunity would require 120% coverage, which, as we know, is not possible. So if authorities, actually managed to vaccinate 70% of the population, the efficacy was only 50%. That would imply that only 60% of the population would contract the virus at some point. Basically, this all goes to say that even if we have a vaccine, there is still significant social distancing measures that are required and will be required to flatten the curve. And coverage would really have to approach 100% to render social distancing measures redundant. So the real question is, we know that efficacy isn't going to be there, given that coverage is not going to be there, given the rate of the benchmarking set by the FDA. So I can talk a little bit about why mass vaccination won't work, and that sort of can be broken down into 4 issues.
Rupa, just to quickly follow up on what you were saying, I want to give a disclaimer to our listeners. We didn't come up with those stats ourselves. It was from a Deutsche Bank research report that we read. So all credits to them for providing this contrarian view. So we got our hands on some stuff. Anyways, quick other note about vaccines. So I think there are more than 200 different COVID vaccines under development right now, more than 200 across the globe. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, sure, we have some, more promising ones and not so promising ones, but, and I don't even know. I mean, people like Alex Jones and conspiracy theorists would obviously come up with all kinds of narratives, but I do think that the debate about efficacy rates and the debates about what this vaccine would entail is quite a valid debate. And I do think no matter what Trump does, the public faith in the vaccine has been somewhat undermined. I think, yes, partly due to the administration, but also partly just because you are pushing out a vaccine at an incredibly fast rate. And we don't know what's going to happen with social distancing. But yes, Rupa, before you jump on to talk about why mass vaccination won't work, again, to preface it, is from a recent economic conference that we've attended, and we will keep the source anonymous and everything. But it's a really, really fascinating insights on that front.
I think there are sort of 4 issues, as I mentioned. The first is distributional issues, that we have never really put a platform in place or a structure in place to distribute a vaccine to everyone if we would have to do that. And I don't think that has been developed sufficiently in the past, few months, that if we had a vaccine tomorrow, we would not know how to get that out to everyone. The second thing is sort of the immunological response time, which is that if you get the vaccine, you're not going to be COVID-free, COVID-protected the next day. It'll take a few months or a few weeks for your body to get used to that vaccine. You're going to have to maybe get sick a little bit to sort of get over and be protected by the vaccine. So it's not an instantaneous protection. The third thing is that most of the vaccines in trial right now will require multiple doses, which means you'll get one shot and then have to come back again in a few months to get it again, which means that the completion rate of both doses might be low in certain areas, again, resulting in more distributional issues. I think the most important problem, in my opinion, is the lack of confidence in the vaccine. I think it's very clear that this vaccine has been being produced in a rush with lower efficacy standards. So it really is up to the government and the FDA and how they market this vaccine to make sure people feel safe and comfortable taking it. Not sure, Alex, if you have anything to add on to that.
Not a ton about vaccine. One thing I will mention, and this is like not based on my own personal paper reading, but there's a former grad student in the EEB department at Princeton who actually co-wrote that original paper on how long COVID can survive on surfaces. His name's Dylan Morris, and he does a lot of Facebook posts like correcting misinformation around COVID reporting. And so one thing that sort of ties into this vaccine efficacy is also how long you remain immune after actually being infected with COVID. So there were a lot of big headlines about sort of antibody levels declining very quickly after infection. And again, I don't have any like great sourcing on this, but he did mention in his like misinformation correcting that that was very preliminary research, and it was sort of balanced out by some other interesting papers finding more of a maintenance of, I guess, not just antibody levels, but like an immune response to COVID. So even if the vaccine outlook might be a little bit dreary in terms of how many people would have to be infected, if you think about how many people we're seeing reinfected, it is, you know, a case here and there. It's very much like anecdotal evidence of reinfection, as opposed to like every person you know who's been infected has also been reinfected.
Let me deliver some final pessimistic punchlines here. If you have any takeaway from today's session, this is also something I've learned from recently talking to a former policymaker at White House, and he says that even mass vaccine. So this is what we talked. We talked about the efficacy of the vaccine, and Rupa talked about getting vaccine to everybody. And let's say all this happens by next summer, everybody is vaccinated. What would that happen? And I actually think there might still be a very pessimistic picture going on, because you have to realize the vaccine that we're currently being developed right now is kind of an intramuscular shot, right? You get a shot that gives you some kind of antibody, but it won't cause any antibody in your lungs or mucuses. So in other words, it won't reduce the amount of viruses in your mouth, in your nose, in your mucous membranes if you were to contract COVID. And even if you get the vaccine and you yourself are somehow developed this antibody, you could still spread it to your friends and families. Sure, their symptoms will be less so, but they will still get the COVID. So what will likely happen is the case count will not come down. The death count will come down. The fatality rate will come down. So I think the most important question that we really have to ask, not just for a Trump administration, but also for a Biden administration, is that what would be your benchmark and framework going forward? Will you still be using case count like we currently do? Right now we say we see a rise in cases and therefore we'll have to shut something down. We're not saying we see a rise in fatality rate. So down the road, will we say case count going up is fine and therefore we have to switch to death count? Will that happen? So I think that's a very, very interesting and crucial question for us to think about. And it goes back to the greater trade-off of economics, right? There has been so many people on the conservative side of things who have come out and said, if you shut down the economy, if you enact social distancing, that kills people down the road later, right? Because if you don't have economic growth, you don't fix the road. If you don't, we've had an economist, Paul Freitas from London School of Economics. We had one of the most famous but most controversial philosophers, Peter Singer, on our podcast talking about this issue, which is how do you balance the trade-offs? I think the trade-offs definitely exist, right? And also, if you devote all the medical resources to COVID, if you devote all the economic resources to COVID, you will not be saving lives that you otherwise could be in Africa, right? We could be saving tons of life right now by distributing bed nets very easily in Africa. And nowadays, as Peter Singer would say, we're doing all this COVID-19 thing simply because it's killing us. And by us, he means rich, developed country people. So, tons of viruses has been going around the world, and there are tons of things that we could do to help address and save more lives. But it's just now we feel there's more of a priority to save developed countries, people's lives. So I think that is another question that we have to think about. So I think it comes down to what Biden's plan is, because it's obviously not realistic for Biden to say, hey, we're going to have a national white lockdown. People are going to have riots on the street. You will get people vaccinated, but people won't trust it that much. But even if you get everybody vaccinated, they will still kind of contract it. The case count will still go up. You will still need social distancing, so people are pissed off, things like that. So do you change your benchmark? Do you think about economic trade-offs? And beware, the average median age of people who die from coronavirus are like 82 in Europe. In the United States, it's like 75, 78, which is slightly lower because, U.S. people are a little bit more obese, and also U.S. Americans are, in general, younger than a lot of the Europeans. But there's a study that came out recently, which is basically saying if you're dying from COVID-19, on average, you have 5 more years to live. So I don't want to sound like, a bad person here, but most people who die from COVID-19 are older people that don't have that many years to go. They're not so. People be having, tons of, for example, Notre Dame opened up the university. This goes back to school closing. Notre Dame opened the university. There was an outrage because there was some super spreader event. Yes, there was a super spreader event, but nobody actually died and nobody really had any fatality, right? So now I'm not saying I endorse this view or not, but students and other people would say, why shouldn't we open up schools? Why shouldn't Princeton open up? Assuming that if all of us go back to campus and we would accept a much better education, why shouldn't we go back if we're not going to have anything? So I think it literally comes back to all those important questions. And I don't think vaccine, if there's any lessons, it's just that it's not going to be magically solving our problem. I'm actually personally very, very pessimistic about the outlook of vaccines, the efficacy of vaccines, how we're going to get vaccines to people. And even if we get vaccines to people, what do you do? And I think the question for policymakers, and I don't think Biden has addressed this. To be honest, Biden's campaign has not come out with this, which is that, will you maximize healthcare outcomes, public health outcomes, subject to economic constraints? Namely, as long as you keep a certain unemployment rate there, and as long as your economy doesn't tank, you should save as many lives as possible. Or do you maximize the economic outcomes, such as, getting the unemployment rate down and getting people's jobs and reopening the economy, as long as you keep under the constraint of public health criteria, as long as you keep the fatality rate down? So what will be the trade-off? What will be the framework? I'll let our listeners make up their mind, but I do think that it is dangerous that we keep hearing this, that vaccines will solve all the problems, or if you advocate for reopening, you're killing babies or you're killing old people. So I rambled a lot. Would love to hear you guys follow-up thoughts on this matter.
One thing that I will say right off the bat is that, you mentioned sort of doing the economic calculus of like money versus lives versus health outcomes. And it's always important to remember, people make the comparison between COVID and the flu. And on a healthcare level, like on what actually happens in your body, we've been over it 100 times. They're not the same thing and they're not comparable. However, one thing that people do say is we don't shut down over the flu. We didn't shut down over certain other diseases, even when people do die from it or have adverse health outcomes. Now, the response isn't to get all like, oh, they're very different. The response is to say, like, how are they different? Why didn't we shut down in this other case? What was the economic calculation? Because even if in our head we're not thinking, how many lives are worth having the economy open, we're making that decision implicitly by how we treat a given virus and a given outbreak. And how we treat the flu is we vaccinate for it and we keep sending our kids to school. And how we've treated coronavirus is we're trying to get a vaccine and some people aren't sending their kids to school, or some schools are just completely shut down. Now, we're in the early days with this, but I think what that indicates is just there is a difference. There's a difference in fatalities. There's a difference in long-term health outcomes. You're seeing a lot of people who aren't actually recovering, who are having symptomology for a long time and losing. in like very bald economic terms, losing productivity because of that, like losing, years of their lives, losing, like physical ability, mental ability, and physical ability. So I do think that those economic trade-offs are always going to be thought about. And I think that, I personally don't have a take on how to measure it and what is the right way to measure it. But I think it's important to realize that we have always thought about it, or that's not the right way to say it. It's always been implicit in how we run our lives, because we do choose, to live with certain things and not live with other things.
Tough questions. Tough questions to be said. If you're interested in healthcare topics, reach out to us. We'll send you some stuff here and there. But how are the polls? Are we ready to dive into the next round of polls? Christian, Ryan, our team's Neo is coming on soon. We're gonna do a little bit of analysis on what is going on. It seems like it's a nail biter.
I think that the other people that are doing polls right now might have a different take than me, but so far I think everybody's on the edge of their seat. It's getting very weird. And in particular, I think that some of us have our eyes on, I'm guessing it depends on who you ask, but right now, Georgia, Arizona, Texas seem to be where the action is, arguably North Carolina, but we're getting there. It's going to be an absolutely fascinating run to the finish right now. Do we want to go ahead and get into this, or does anybody else want to jump in with some instincts off the bat?
My intuition is that we don't know anything until Pennsylvania goes, and I think Pennsylvania is the only state. I mean, not the only state that matters, but it's the bellwether state.
But yeah, it seems that we won't know Pennsylvania even after days, because
we're not
hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. Exactly.
I was making calls literally 2 hours ago telling people to submit their mail-in ballots. So no.
Oh, really? You could still do that. The deadline was I see.
Yeah. So they could mail it in November 3rd, and they can receive it November 6th. So they won't even get all their votes until November 6th.
Yeah. Certainly a large chunk in Pennsylvania won't be counted until tomorrow morning, as we know. It also seems like there may be something interesting going on with the ballots in Georgia, where it seems that some maybe 60 to 90,000 plus votes have disappeared to a computing glitch. Those of us that are the more cynical might have some take on that, given that it's primarily Democratic districts, but make of it what you will. Yeah, so that's where we are right now, but I think it'll be interesting. One interesting observation: some of the pollsters are writing in right now saying that although Arizona looks like it's pretty much, we have an idea of where it's headed right now, and so far, based on comparisons on the county level with 2016, it seems like it's going to be a pretty solid trend towards Biden in all likelihood. If for some reason in this last stretch here it tips the other direction, then we are suddenly in a very competitive race with I think the polling projections getting in the vein of 50% if Arizona goes to Trump. So yeah, we have a lot to discuss.
Who wants to go first? Neo, Jack, anybody? Let's kick off the late night poll analysis.
So where we sorry, I just hopped on, guys, and everyone watching. We're just talking about the latest results, right?
Yes.
All right, yeah. So things obviously right away. I'm sure you guys have already discussed this. Trump winning. He's probably going to win North Carolina. Georgia is still a chance for Biden. We'll see. Florida, clearly Trump at this point. Arizona, though, bright spot right now, looks good for Biden. Trump won that 46-43. Maricopa County, which is the bulk of the votes in Arizona. Biden right now is up by 8 points, and
he's crushing it in Maricopa.
Yes, exactly. And the election day totals for the GOP aren't there. So unless Trump does something miraculous in the other counties, it's looking good for Biden right now. Now, keep in mind, for Arizona, I should say. Sorry, I've been looking at Pennsylvania very closely right now. I'm, like I said before, I'm from there. Ohio, I don't know if there's still lots to be counted in the cities in Ohio. Trump is winning by about 200 some thousand.
By the way, guys, you remember Mark? Mark is our early. We kicked off the election stream with Mark when he gave the 350 Biden landslide, and now he's like, I'm asking him to come back on the Zoom to talk about this. He was like, I'm not coming back, given my prediction.
I was on Team Landslide too. I thought a big wave, but we're clearly headed to, if not 2016 situation, then maybe a 2018 situation.
Dude, I've been saying this contested election. I look like I'm hindsight 2020.
No. There's a gap. There are places in the armor here where contested results could come out. I think Georgia could end up looking that way.
The Pennsylvania GOP. So far, they have filed a lawsuit in Montgomery County, huge Biden vote sink, try to invalidate 1,200 votes. They have called for the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania to resign. They just now did that, the Pennsylvania GOP state party. So the Pennsylvania GOP is fighting tooth and nail. Like I said, right now, so here are the things that I'm looking at in PA. First of all, most of these, Philadelphia and Montgomery County are both not going to count mail-in ballots for a while. There's like 300 some thousand. They're not going to count for a few days. That's going to be huge Biden vote sink. Into counties that are counting all ballots, especially rural ones, Joe Biden is outperforming Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump is not outperforming his 2016 mark. Also, a lot of so I'm from Adams County, Pennsylvania. If you look at the results on the website right now, Joe Biden only has 19%. That's pretty bad. But you look, every single vote cast tallied has been election day. There's tons of mail-in ballots still out there that are going to sink Trump's margins in these rural counties to probably. Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. A lot of these, for some reason, a lot of counties in Pennsylvania just said, screw it, we're not even going to bother with the mail. And that's what happened. So I think, clearly, this is why I wasn't on the whole landslide thing. Was, Trump still had, according to going back to the whole Nate Silver thing, 40% points to win North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Texas.
People are losing faith in Nate Silver as we speak right now. He predicted a 10% odds for Trump. I mean, what are we seeing right now? I mean, okay, let's keep doing this. All good, but
I do think we have to just refocus. Like, the results we're seeing right now are not going to be what the final results are going to be. Like, the projections that you see on this map are the in-person votes for most states, and so we really we don't know what we don't know in this case.
I also want to push back against the idea that this being a 2018 scenario is anything bad for a Democrat. I mean, that 2018 wound up being a solid Democratic.
Oh no, I'm not. To be clear, I'm not saying that. In terms, especially down ballot, I think we're comfortably looking at a Democratic Senate and House.
It got
I'm just saying.
Democratic Senate, really Democratic Senate. I do not think that at all. I think there will not be a Democratic Senate regardless.
What are the latest numbers on the Senate? I haven't looked at it.
So, North Carolina has now, Trump and Tillis are in the lead. Roy Cooper, the governor, it's been called for him. He's a Democrat in North Carolina, but it's looking very much like Cal Cunningham, North Carolina is not going to win. And if you don't have that, you got to go for Teresa Greenfield. And she's, so far in the early numbers, she's underperforming Biden.
Right.
And so it's still possible. But it's looking, if I had to put money right now, I would say the Democrats win 49 seats in the U.S. Senate.
By the way, guys, I just want to quickly give our listener a somewhat high-level approach, because you really have to focus. I mean, we didn't talk about this at the beginning of the podcast. Senate races in Iowa, Georgia, Maine, Montana, North Carolina, as what Jack was just saying, South Carolina. So Senate races are very, very crucial because, first of all, these are toss-ups that could very, very much tip the scale in either party's directions in terms of what will happen in terms of Senate. But also, they're somewhat predictors of what is happening with the presidential election. So if we go into a contested situation, we don't know what the clarity is on that front, look at the Senate races. So I think that is a very important point to be brought up there, Jack. Yes.
Something on the Senate that I read about recently, though, is, the idea of a blue Senate, that's not just going to be a 51 Democrats, because I feel like on the Democrats compared to the Republicans, you have more of you have more Democratic senators who are likely to sort of compromise on certain issues, whereas it seems to be that the Republican senators are almost strictly party line.
Absolutely.
And so you need more than that 51 majority.
Joe Manchin in West Virginia is not going to vote out for some climate change. I mean, I'm not trying to say he will or he will not, but it's the same situation like what happened in the Republican Party when they had 52 seats back in 2016. They tried to repeal Obamacare, but they didn't actually have the full 50 votes. But it's going to be the same thing, right?
I agree with that. I think that's why I think it should the Democrat should let's say Steve Bullock pulls out a win in Montana or Greenfield wins in Iowa or somehow I don't think Cunningham's going to win North Carolina, but if he did and you get 50 and then Biden wins with Kamala 51, a tiebreaker, I think that's why you'd see a lot of people pushing to repeal the filibuster. And maybe we're deviating off discussion here, so feel free to corral me back in, Tiger. But I think you'd see a lot of calls to end the filibuster forever in the Senate, add Washington, D.C. as a state to get those, there's something to be said about suffrage for the people of Washington, D.C. Clearly, I think, personally, I think in some form, whether that's a state or being retroceded to Maryland, they deserve to have full rights akin to anyone else in the U.S. But you could definitely see that that's going to be solid Democratic senators, 2 more to tack on to buffer against Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema.
Well, the issue is the Senate is heavily in favor of Republicans, right? Because you have those places like North Dakota or whatever that will get 2 Senate seats anyways, whereas all the Democrats, liberal voters are a little bit more clustered in urban areas, and also even in a state like Florida, right? What we're seeing tonight is that the Florida is not a typical coastal city that's just somehow becoming more liberal and you're seeing this kind of shift in blue wave, whatever. It is still somewhat of a conservative stronghold. So I would say that, yes, if you incorporate DC and if you incorporate Puerto Rico or some other, grand statehood and things like that, that might change the Senate shape for a little bit. But for now, I mean, at least for the next maybe even 10, 12 years, the Republicans will still have a much better advantage on the Senate part of things, I think.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think Florida especially has shown to be kind of an outlier. I don't know if we've discussed this before, but
Neil, would you mind talking louder? We couldn't really hear you.
Oh, yeah. So Florida is a bit of an outlier, right? We saw that 2 years ago in 2018 with the midterms. But I think that same case might apply to the general shift in the suburbs in the South and the Sun Belt. What we're seeing in Texas and the Dallas area and Houston area suburbs towards Democrats by very diverse suburb electorates. I don't think that's happening in Florida. You can obviously see that in today's results. And I think it'll be an obvious concern for Democrats once they do their autopsy report on this election, how we should approach, or how the Democrats should approach addressing the growing Hispanic population in the United States. I think this is the first year they're the majority of votes or the plurality of votes in this country. So it's going to be an interesting problem for Democrats to face while they make gains in the suburbs.
If I could just comment on, I totally agree with you, Neil. There's going to be a lot Democrats are going to do a lot of soul searching or whatever, because they clearly have done. Miami-Dade clearly underperformed with the Hispanic population there. Although interestingly, and I saw this, someone shared it on social media, Hispanics in Colorado, which does have a decent Hispanic population, Joe Biden's actually doing better than Hillary. So I think it's you almost have to kind of you wonder if we should stop looking at Hispanic as in and of itself a voting bloc in the U.S. and start thinking more about it's not a monolith. That actually I remember in Spanish 101 or 103 or whatever I took here at Princeton, we talked about this, the differences in Hispanic and Latino voting patterns in the U.S. And I think, from the perspective of strategists, I guess you're going to have to start, doing soul searching and saying, all right, maybe we can't just have the same message for, Hispanic and Latino voters in Florida as we do in the Western states, because they're clearly voting. So far, the results have shown that these voting patterns can be completely divergent, and they're going to have to deal with that in the future if they want to maintain or become more competitive.
I have a comment to make on the point of Florida.
Yes, please, Jake. My dear friend Jake, you've joined. Please.
Hi, everybody. I go to GW. I'm one of Tiger's buddies here that he's met while he's been down in DC. I guess just as someone who was, adamantly supporting the polling this time around, thinking that they've improved upon their methodologies from 2016, having more confidence in them, I find it very disheartening to see the results that have been coming out tonight, especially in Florida, where you see Trump having about a 3.5% lead. I think the polling average was about 2.5% for Biden. And in my opinion, a 6% polling error is just kind of unacceptable. And I'm just trying to understand why it's an outlier. And also, given what we've seen in Florida, how is it encouraging that I expect the polling to be accurate in states where the results in Florida are highly correlated with, such as North Carolina, Georgia, and why should I trust the results that are coming out in the Rust Belt in the Midwest? And I guess are the polls wrong again? Is this just something that we just have to accept and think that they're going to be outliers, or like what's going on here?
Sully said it's still too soon. I don't know. Christian, what do you think?
Jake, I think that you're looking at a sample size issue here in Florida. For one, I don't think that the results are necessarily skewed in the way that, or rather, they're skewed in a different way because that you're dealing with a larger language barrier in a lot of senses. I think that you get a lot of sensitivity to polling based on that, and I think that that's been a factor in Florida. Something that's been talked about by analysts leading into this, for one. But to your general point, yeah, I mean, we're looking at a 5+ point split in terms of theory versus reality, and that's an absolute mystery to me. So I'm with you. I think we see the same thing in Georgia right now. Someone can figure out the split. I'm not sure what it is at this point, but it's really it's pretty egregious. So yeah, camp anti-polar is looking pretty good tonight.
So Jake, I just want to quickly follow up on your point, because I was listening to this podcast interview done by Ezra Klein and Nate Silver right before the election. And Nate Silver said something very confidently, and I did really agree with him when I listened to it, which is that back in 2016, huge amounts of undecided voters basically turned to Trump, right? So that was one thing. And second of all, a lot of the polls were very close. So if you had a 2-point or 3-point, whatever kind of margin, and then somehow it flipped to Trump, it's kind of acceptable kind of deviation in the pollsters. And he was saying this year, if you're leading by 6 points consistently, there's no way you really flip it. There's just no way if you keep flipping. I mean, if you've been consistently polling under your opponent by 5% or something in Pennsylvania, like Trump under Biden for 5%, people were just saying there's just no way that Trump would win in Pennsylvania. That's what people have been saying. And that's why pollsters have been so confident, because they really think they got it. And then if you look at the 5% gap, they don't think that's not the acceptable room for error anymore. Even if you account for the acceptable room for error, the Democrat would still win. Basically, that's their theory.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I was also hearing that, pollsters this time around adjusted their the weighting in terms of their polling. They weighted more heavily in terms of education. And yeah, I mean, I was hearing from Nate Silver as well that, the polling would need to be even, more egregiously, worse than it was in 2016 for, Biden to see these types of losses. So that's why it's just kind of puzzling, just as a viewer, trying to interpret these polls, trying to see how they play out on an actual electoral scale. Going forward, are people actually going to be able to trust polls? Because based on what we're seeing now, I know the results aren't conclusive yet. I know we haven't gotten a lot of these states, but even 538 predicting North Carolina, predicting Georgia, predicting Florida, it really seems to be deviating from what the predictions have been.
I think something that's interesting is that 538 can only rely on the polls, and something that Nate Silver talked about in the 538 podcast was that the polling might fall victim to this phenomenon where poll makers try to fit their polls to the popular narrative going into the election. And so, for example, like they might choose to skew their sample in favor of, for example, showing that Biden's going to win Florida, because the conventional wisdom is that Biden's going to win Florida. And I don't know necessarily how much of an impact that may have had, but that could be one factor in the split we're seeing between the theory and reality right now.
David, you should have joined much earlier. We had a great discussion at the beginning about whether polling and forecasting is a tautology. And just a quick recap to some of our listeners who have just joined, or if you stayed on the whole time, toast to you. But which I think some of our listeners have amazingly stayed on as long as I have. But the issue with poll, first of all, Jack has talked about the issue of should we trust the polls, which he can bring up a little bit. But even if we can trust the polls, it's very hard to assign just one kind of probability to a highly fluctuating kind of outcome, like someone's voting behavior, right? If you think about all the voters, how they vote, that's each of them's pattern is a random variable, and you're trying to map something. It's very, very hard. And that is what my friend Michael Senka, who was saying it's a chaotic system and you shouldn't be able to really predict it. And I think that the heart of the issue is that we don't have that much data from previous elections, right? If you don't have that much previous data from previous elections, the only way you can really make good simulation and the only way that you can really make good predictions, and that's what Nate Silver does, is using the Bayesian method, which is that you go in with a prior belief. You start with a small data set. The Bayesian method doesn't require you to have too much data sets. You just keep updating your beliefs. You run simulations, and that's how you do it. But if your priors are wrong, if your prior beliefs are wrong, then you're screwed. So it is, yeah. So that is a huge issue. I don't know if anyone want to jump in on that front. So
I do kind of just have a question to pose. I may be changing topic from Tiger's question a little too abruptly, so I apologize for that. But I'm just curious, kind of what you guys think the effect of anti-democratic institutions that America has on polling accuracy. So, like, I mean, love him or hate him, like, it's true that the Electoral College and the Senate are in some sense small d democratic. So, do you think they affect the accuracy of polls, the precision of polls?
Two different questions. Are the Electoral College and institutions like it anti-democratic? I think the answer is yes. Do they affect polling? Yeah, great question. That goes back to Tiger's tautology point, or maybe kind of like a does fiction make fact kind
Ladies
of thing.
And gentlemen, please welcome
I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting one.
States, Donald.
Right about
definitely
it.
affects
and
turnout.
Big tech doesn't want to talk
if you
about
extrapolate
it.
from that, then maybe, but I'm not sure what
and
to do.
They're not allowed to talk.
Very quickly,
and we have suppression. We have suppression.
Give a shout out to my friend Jansen Chu, who's a good friend of mine. He sent me this article. If he's watching, he'll like this. But he sent me this article written by George Soros. And George Soros is a big guy, a big hedge fund guy, but he's calls himself a philosopher.
Ever seen anything like it.
Key thing is called reflexivity.
Son walks in. His son had no job.
You may predict something.
He left the military. Unfortunately, it wasn't good.
Whatever. But this action will actually end up influencing the outcome in a completely different way, which is exactly what we're seeing
like
with polling. With a lot of those issues, is that
he follows the father into country. A recent Gallup poll found that 56% of Americans say they're better off today than they were 4 years ago.
It gives people, why would you vote
under the auspices of
your Democratic candidate when you see a 90 to 10 likelihood?
Joe Biden.
I mean, I wouldn't vote. Why?
You're not going to want to have Joe Biden.
Blue strong state,
if we had see the media, look at all the media back there. If we had,
doesn't matter.
If they had to cover, him for 2 months,
I think to add on to that, it affects a certain type of voter, right? Because even if I live in, unless you live in a very homogenous state like Wyoming,
they would be out of business. At Biden,
or let's better example, Hawaii, which has lower state legislature, maybe it's the state Senate has one Republican in it. Like literally, there's like 24 Democrats and one Republican. Like you could still vote in down ballot issues, right?
The only guy I've ever seen.
There are plenty of voters in the U.S. who
runs by saying
who only vote in presidential years, whether by choice or just because they don't follow it closely. And I think you definitely could make the argument. And I'm sure
I've covered
plenty of researchers have done this. Not that I know off the top of my head that shows.
I've been enemies
that,
also.
You could argue
but
the
I've never seen somebody saying
depresses
we
turnout,
will raise
especially
your
in places
taxes. They want to give you
there's not also a contentious down ballot election like a governor's race at the same time, or a Senate race, or ballot initiatives.
We can't let that happen.
So yeah, I could I definitely I think Chris mentioned he just kind of made the statement it definitely affects turnout, and I agree entirely with that.
I apologize to some of our viewers. I accidentally unmuted the Trump's rally, and it was talking over some of our members. That was completely my mistake. I really do apologize. but now we're all back. Yes, by the way, my friends Mary Elliott Stone and Francesca Walton have joined us. They wanted us to speak a little bit about the future of American conservatism, which I think would be a good time for all of us to talk. I mean, it doesn't have to feel like a formal presentation or anything. We can have a casual chat about basically what is going on. I mean, we're talking about the polls right now. Fran, Mel, what we're seeing right now is, I wouldn't say red mirage or red wave, but we're definitely not seeing the 350 Biden electoral college vote type of blue wave. So I don't know what's going on. What do you guys have in mind? What's on your mind tonight?
Well, in response to the polls, I was just going to say, I've been talking to a lot of people because I was also kind of surprised, or I am surprised right now with everything that's going on. And so I've been talking to a lot of people, and a lot of people have just been saying there are so many people in this country that are just kind of,
it's
silent
11
about,
o'clock.
That's my computer. Silent about how they feel, especially if they're in support of Trump. They just aren't very open about it. And if somebody asks, I've heard people say that if anybody asks them, that they will not open up about it, and they will tell everyone they're voting for Biden even if they aren't. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing play out right now, which I definitely was not expecting.
Wait, Mary Elliott, I'm so glad you brought up that point, because that's something that I often think about. I often think about that in terms of conversations that I have with friends on Princeton's campus, but also friends at home. I believe that 538 has come up a good amount these past few hours. I'm a big fan. Would definitely recommend to those who aren't checking it constantly like I am. But one of their recent episodes talked about, shy Trumpists and how there aren't, apparently, 538's perspective, so take that as you will. There aren't as many people as you would think who are, I don't want to say too shy to share their beliefs, but apparently there aren't as many people who are more shy on that front than you'd imagine. So I think that is one reason why, one way to look at the polls now. But I think another reason to look, or another way to look at the polls now, is just taking into account mail-in ballots and ballots that were signed this morning, just because a lot of states start counting their mail-in ballots today, and some states started counting them 15 days ago. So I think that's also something that's important to consider.
Yeah, Tiger, actually, if you're going to say something, go ahead, Tiger. I don't want to cut you off.
I wasn't trying to say something.
Okay. I'd like to talk more about like kind of the shy Trump voter thing. I think maybe in my mind, I mentioned this earlier. I'm a very conservative. I'm from Adams County, Pennsylvania, extremely, Trump supporting. And I think the thing that kind of is bemusing to me is that we have this, and this could be true, I'm not going to say it's not, but we have the simultaneous idea that there are shy Trump voters who won't express their support, which certainly may be true in instances. But at the same time, Trump supporters, where I live in the very pro-Trump area, are extremely vocal about it. I mean, you see, the boat rallies, the regular rallies, the putting of flags. There were people. I was handing out candy 2 days ago, or however many days ago it was, and people were driving around with giant Trump flags off their car during trick or treat. Like, people who are Trump supporters are extremely vocal about it, at least in areas that tend to support him anyway. I think maybe one way to think about it, I don't know if you all would agree or disagree. You could perhaps say, well, let's say of all of Trump's supporters, 80% are, I'm just making this up, 80% are very, patriotic, pro-Trump, loud and proud, while the remaining 20% are, maybe in urban areas or at Princeton where it's a very liberal campus, very dominated, very uniform, really, if we're being honest, especially if relative to American politics as a whole. Like, maybe those type of people are definitely going to be less likely to express their support. So I think, maybe, I don't know. I just think it's kind of, regardless of whether it's true or not, you have to kind of accept the fact that it's like almost contradictory. Like, at the same time, there may be silent Trump supporters, which may, I'm sure I know people who support the president and are very reluctant to say so. But at the same time, you have countless people who are unabashedly in support of him, regardless of his faults. And it's just interesting, at the very least.
Yeah, I think it just depends on where you are.
Fran, no, I want to quickly follow up on your point. This is something that Jake and I debated at dinner a couple days ago, which is the counter-narrative nature of a lot of the supporters for Trump or beyond, or even for Biden, whatever. It's that when we read traditional legacy media sources, whether it's CNN or Fox News or New York Times, they often box it into a certain narrative, right? It's always the Midwest person who actually hates Trump, or a black person in California who was fighting for civil rights. So there's that typical archetype. What's that word? Archetypal kind of, character that you would see in some of those stories, and they're very inspiring, they're progressive, and such and so on. But they fit into a certain narrative. What you really don't see is someone that's black and far right, someone that's gay and supports Trump, which I think sometimes happen, and also Chinese who support. By the way, this is something that I think gradually got to learn. Overwhelming support for Trump amongst the Chinese American communities. And my liberal friends could not understand. They go, why is that? Because Trump said Kung Flu, he started a trade war with China. He clearly doesn't really like Chinese people when he calls China virus or Wuhan virus. Why do Chinese Americans, why are they conservative? Is it just because they like the tax cut? Like, what's the deal? And I think that there are inherent reasons behind it, which is that maybe they like Trump's certain anti-China policies. Maybe they like Trump's other conservative stance. Maybe they feel more threatened by the woke left than the racists on the right. So you don't see those, I guess, the stories where people that don't seem to fit in this strict narrative. So a lot of the discourse, I guess, that goes back to our very beginning of the discussion, which is the discourse and social political discourse, miss a lot of those stories that actually end up shaping the outcome of a narrative. Certainly back in 2016, nobody even thought about the Rust Belt. I mean, only in 2016 did we have that kind of awakening. But before that, nobody really cared, right? So.
Yeah, and I think that's not necessarily a point on the silent Trump voter, but when we're talking about it, it was kind of the whole point where the typical Trump voter, or I should say the Trump wave in 2016, was really a pushback to a lot of the cultural movements and cultural impositions that the left has tried to place on a lot of these working class blue collar people, where Hillary Clinton obviously calling them deplorable. You got the cancel culture, you got the suppression of certain speech that are deemed politically incorrect. And I think the future of American conservatism is really continuing to provide that sort of like sense of security. Like, it's okay for you to be white, working class. It's okay for you to not be totally politically correct and hold certain viewpoints. I think Trump harbors that, and whether or not Trump's the nominee, just the fact that he's performing well in tonight's election gives you the impression that Republicans are going to want to be represented by someone like Trump in the future. So that's something that the Republican Party is going to need to take into consideration as well as a result of the election.
Something that's interesting is in terms of like that, what you're talking about, like that white working class kind of, I guess, social conservatism, is whether that can be harnessed by the Democratic Party in terms of thinking about the future of conservatism. Because, like, for example, is the future of the Democratic Party, if Trump wins tonight or in the coming days, going to be like the Joe Manchin, economically liberal but socially conservative, like, model of senator? It's interesting to think about.
That's a nice flip around on the socially liberal, economically conservative phrase that all the people use. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting to think about whether is that what Democrats have to be to win back the white working class, or is the white working class even like important to the future of American democracy in terms of like being a large voting bloc? Is it more going to be about like winning minority groups?
I've heard about this as a discussion of why Bernie Sanders is so successful, despite being like a self-proclaimed socialist, which like is historically a pretty unpopular title for a politician to wield in America. And I think a big part of it is that he really doesn't use identity politics in the way most of the Democratic Party does. And he mostly puts his economic plans out there and says, these are the economic plans I believe are going to help everyone. And look at it's actually a rather like socialist argument that he's using, a rather populist argument, I guess.
And St. Petersburg
and I think that could be a potential future. But it's important to consider kind of the Democratic bases that might be alienated by that in the process of, maybe gaining a few votes in Michigan and Ohio.
This might be switching gears a little bit from what you just said, Sully, but sort of back to the idea of like the future of conservatism. I'd be curious to hear what people think about sort of like this whole Lincoln Project. And, you have these traditional Republicans who are pushing back and they're saying, no, Trump's not us. We're different. We are traditional Republicans. He represents something else. And sort of the idea that, some claim him and some don't. And so where does the Republican Party sort of fall?
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider that distinction because, small sample size, the friends that I interact with, I think a lot of people say, okay, you're conservative. Oh, you automatically are a Trumpist. And I think that's, I think that it's an important distinction that not necessarily every conservative is a big fan of Trump. And I think what's important, going forward is that we kind of go back to those Republican ideals that seem to have been so lost these past few years.
I do want to quickly push back a little bit on that because not just to Fran's point, but I guess this part at large. By the way, Jake and I, we are another friend of ours, Max, brought up the Lincoln Project, and Jake and I were just like, "What are you talking about? It's not the mainstream." I mean, the Lincoln Project is not. Yeah, Max just showed up on the screen.
Yeah, we just kind of rejected the idea that they're an actual like political force that
is influencing legislations and such and so on.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like I want to hear you guys' thoughts on this because I really feel like the Republican Party is Trump Party. I'm not saying it's a good way or a bad way, but it's like if Bernie Sanders, right, won the nomination and Bernie Sanders won in a national landslide against, a centrist kind of Republican, but the Democrats would be shocked and they'll probably start to realize, oh, maybe we should follow Bernie Sanders' plan or something like that. And I think maybe that's something that happened with Trump, which is that he won in such a shocking way and people are listening to him and people are clearly following him, and I don't see the distinction anymore, to be honest, Fran.
And I had a question as well. Like, does the Lincoln Project actually have policy proposals that they're trying to impose, or are they just like an organization in opposition to Trump?
Their main policy goal is to get Trump out of office.
Okay, well that's not a real policy. Like that's not.
I mean, I think like this is an interesting question. I remember seeing this somewhere. I forget where. But like the question is like, is Trumpism a thing, or is it just Trump kind of like, using his personality to push through conservative policies in the Republican Party backing him because he's someone who seems to be finding success with the electorate? And I think like it's an interesting question. Like I'm not sure that Tom Cotton has the character to push through whatever you call Trumpism, because Trump is the core of Trumpism.
But to be honest, why isn't so? What is Trumpism, for example? Is it just because he's offensive, politically incorrect? He appeals to his base in a certain way? Because let me challenge you guys on this. Trump, during his 4 years in office, he did everything that a conservative would really want to do. Tax cut, repeal Obamacare, court appointments. That's why Ben Shapiro said, I would vote for Trump because he is fundamentally a conservative. He did the policies I wanted. And China hawk, everything, trade wars, whatever. He did everything that the conservative party, the Republican Party actually supported. I mean, he didn't come in and started doing random stuff, right? He just appeals to his base in a very weird way. He appeals to his base in such a simplistic way. He just talks, he gives simple points, and they love it. They eat that up. I mean, he doesn't need the elaborate rational arguments that the traditional politicians use. He just appeals to his base, but then still does Republican policy. So why is that Trumpism? I thought he was just good conservatism.
Yeah, I think a term that I've heard just in the past, month or so that I hadn't really heard before is this idea of like Trump is basically mask off Republican, where he like you said, he has all the same policies that a normal Republican would want to put into place, but he just doesn't sort of sugarcoat it and say, the things that might be more palatable from a politician standpoint. Where it's not, there is no distinction. Trumpism is just explicitly Republican policy.
I don't want to explicitly psychoanalyze him, but like, I don't know the extent to which he actually believes in those things, or whether he is just supporting Republican policies because the Republican Party allows him to have power and kind of like stroke whatever, deep primal, desires he has.
Liberal talking points alert.
I mean, but like, he just does not clearly have a strong commitment to these policies, like in his personal life before he started running for president. And like the only things he's showed like a large amount of passion for are like trade wars and border walls and protectionism.
And also, like, I feel like he has, so like, he obviously isn't the most fiscally responsible president. He hasn't really done anything towards the budget, which I think is a very conservative ideal. He's been very sympathetic towards the Obamacare's protections of pre-existing conditions. I feel like he supported stimulus packages. I feel like Trump has a lot of conservative, non-conservative policy positions that he's willing to do because it's politically beneficial to him. So I think there are some benefits to Trumpism, and that he's not like a toe the line conservative. He has veered off the path a bit.
I guess the question is whether Trump co-opted the Republican Party or he was a natural evolution of the direction the Republican Party was moving in. And something that I'm wondering is, like, win or lose in the coming days, does the Republican Party continue to go down this direction of like populism, and I guess you could say norm breaking, we could call it, and
stop fucking bothering me.
Like, does that trend continue regardless of whether Trump is at the helm of it?
David, I think that that's really contingent on a lot of what happens tonight and over the next couple of days. And I mean that very seriously. I think this election will dictate in a lot of terms what happens with that, because there will be, without question, I think, a contingent of people that will be Trump, Republicans in Congress, in the Senate going forward. They won't call themselves that, but look at Marjorie Taylor Greene just won her congressional seat. She becomes the first open supporter of the QAnon theory to be elected to the House of Representatives. So, I do think that there will be people that carry forward the torch.
Conservatism.
Well, I think there will be a cultural, you don't have to call it conservatism. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it Trumpism. There will be a torch carried forward from this movement, from this period of history into the next 2 years. I'd argue possibly even longer than that. Whether or not that is the GOP proper is another story. I think that's contingent on whether or not we have a re-election. Which, by the way, if anybody's following the 538, I'm sorry, I know I've been talking very much, but I've been basically just staring at the polls and doing math. And right now, what I'm seeing is that there's a very interesting kind of play out here with what happens in Arizona. So keep an eye on that.
Please update us, Christian. What is going on? Quick update.
Okay, well, the sort of general theory here in terms of the vote counts is that we're not going to know anything for a while, for one, because Pennsylvania is not going to have everything done until Friday, perhaps. And certainly there's some continuing issues with Georgia and Florida in terms of the vote counts and in terms of some glitches going on with the polling numbers. Then, interestingly, in Arizona, we have sort of a baked in, I think, what is the point lead? Does anybody know off the top of their head? I'll get it. It's 200,000 votes for Biden in the lead right now, 1.28 to 1.08. But at the same time, it's important to note that in Arizona, the early votes are counted and the mail-in votes are counted at the very beginning, right? So this 75% votes counted, you should understand, also does skew right towards Democrats because they tend to be the ones that vote early and vote by mail. So once all the math is said and done, if we have a hypothetical scenario, Nate Silver did the math on this, that Arizona goes to Biden, but Biden loses Pennsylvania, we have a realistic chance of a 269 to 269 split.
Yo.
Which would be incredible, obviously.
Yo, dude. Okay.
I'm not saying that'll happen, but Pennsylvania is obviously a toss-up state. In Arizona, it could still happen.
And I think
I'm staring at Arizona because I think it's
not potentially be the deciding electoral vote.
What's that, Jake?
I think in that situation, the congressional districts in Maine and Nebraska would come into play as possibly giving the deciding electoral vote, which is crazy.
I lean toward like let's not go there because that would be incredible. But at the same time, no, it's worth doing the math on this because it could happen.
So I mean, like going into Tiger, but going into tonight, if you think about it, the odds of Trump winning Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Am I missing any? But winning all of those states seemed highly improbable given the favorable polling that Biden was getting.
I think it's worth just mentioning, just in case anyone watching isn't clear, if the election is a 269 tie, that would almost certainly mean Donald Trump would become president because the way the House votes is by state delegation. And so basically, if the majority of your representatives for a state are of a party, they will decide what your state's vote is for. And I don't know, I haven't been following some of the House elections as closely. I think Fox News called the House for the Democrats a while back, but it would almost certainly be Republican. The state delegations would be in favor of the Republicans, meaning that Donald Trump would win. Though that is just one example, of many possible scenarios, and PA would have to go red for that. Which is
called me crazy.
I'm not saying it'll happen.
You all called me crazy when you pulled up that 538 10% odds thing when I sent that article and telling you guys it's tough.
Now where Mark's
I will add
embarrassed on his prediction.
Sorry,
I think that's why Mark's not here right now. He's just embarrassed, right? Like
Mark, our friend Mark is hugely embarrassed.
How politically illiterate he really is.
Yeah, saying 250 votes. Okay, let's not trash on him. He's a great friend, but
no, Mark's a liberal elitist. They always do this.
It's 11:20. This is the part of the podcast that soon devolves into the actual shooting the shit part. So we had the actual analysis for 3 hours. Okay, guys. So can
I give one more brief thing?
Yes, please.
Arizona. I know I'm harping on Arizona, but I think that this is going to be possibly the story of the election. So Arizona, another thing to keep in mind. Again, we're looking at a likely Biden scenario, but at the same time, the last time that a president was, the last time that they went blue was with Bill Clinton, and that was the single blip between that. You go straight Republican all the way back to FDR. So Trump, obviously, the Bushes, the whole 9 yards. That is a Republican safe state. This could be the upset, but it could also throw us into a very interesting tailspin. I think it's definitely worth thinking about.
I want to jump in before we move on real quick, just because we were talking about the tie. I just saw they just updated the results in Pennsylvania, and Joe Biden's from Scranton, and Joe Biden actually did better, which is a surprise, than Hillary did in Scranton by a few thousand votes. Which is in Lackawanna County, which is where Scranton is, which is a good sign. Just so we're thinking about the possibilities here of a tied election. That there's been signals each way, with Trump doing well in certain counties, and now Biden making some gains in northeastern PA. So it still could happen though, Tiger. So I guess if you think that was I'm not saying that.
Okay, let me correct it. I still think Biden could probably pull this off, but in a very nail-biting way. But I mean, people, dude, it's like Nate Silver wrote an article like 2 days ago. He was saying why I won't count Trump out. I mean, of course you're not counting him out, but you gave him 10% likelihood. What do you expect the public to read? Like, no. I mean, yes, like I've studied statistics. I know that 1 in 10th of a chance is not that bad, but like most Americans reading that would just be like, yes, you've counted him out. So anyways, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of the polls, but yes, by the way, I think Mel asked Christian about the votes thing.
So Arizona won or went blue.
Sorry?
I just heard that Arizona went blue.
Oh, wait, what?
I don't know.
I think that was just a couple news, like Fox included, just called it for Biden.
Yo, also, Ohio went for Trump too.
That's absurd.
Desk just called.
That's Ohio absurd. Yo, whoa.
Wait, so wait, who called it in Arizona?
I think Fox did.
Yeah, wow. I know Fox has. I'm not sure who else.
All right. Well, then that's folks. If that's true, that's the election. It's over. Like
what do you
that.
mean?
No.
Christian, what do you mean?
We can't go that far.
I know. I'm not saying that. Like, okay, I know technically you shouldn't like call it or anything, but that. I mean, hold on. Let's do some. Okay.
You're saying that Biden's won now?
No. Let me retract. Let me recant. That's not necessarily true, but okay. The thing is, the general Democratic voting bases, right, as of now in the election, are going to center around like possibly the Midwest, right? That's in contention. Pennsylvania. I'm discounting right now the Carolinas and Florida. But if we're looking primarily at the possibilities for a path to victory for Biden, I think it's going to come from Arizona and the Midwest. And I think that the pollsters were saying like yesterday that the odds of a Trump victory without Arizona and this outcome dropped to like 30%. So it's definitely not a given, but we're looking much more at a Biden victory if Arizona's been called. So anyway, no, that's not to say that it's a given. I'm just saying that that it becomes a much tougher path to victory for Trump without Arizona.
Whew, but Ohio, anyways.
I think Fox called Ohio and Florida for Trump.
Which anyone
Florida was a given.
Was anyone called the Peters race in Michigan for Senate?
Well,
no.
Okay, I do think, by the way, since if we want to take a quick break from the polls, going back to what David was saying, right? He asked a great question whether Trump is kind of already going along a trend that is already changing for the future of American conservatives and things like that, or did he really disrupt things? And this is what I would say, which is something I've been meaning to bring up in our first part of the discussion about social political discourse. And I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on this, because Joe Rogan, everybody knows Joe Rogan, runs the most famous, successful podcast. Every day he goes on for 3 hours and stuff. So many guys and girls, and especially guys, listen to him. And he somehow is pushing for this, whether it's narrative or whatever, that saying that the deep state or the government obviously is covering up some truth, right? Some truth about anything, liberal truth, conservative truth, anyways. And I think whether you called him right or wrong, I mean, he had Alex Jones on, and there was a big backlash and but also on the other hand, millions of people tuned in. So it seems that whether you agree with his politics or not, there's a rise in counter narrative media, right? Podcasting. What we're doing right now is counter narrative. It's not following a specific mainstream narratives. And what happens, especially on places like Joe Rogan and whatever, is this kind of discourse that is completely different from whatever you read in New York Times, whatever. They just say wild stuff. And I think this has been a huge change in the socio-political discourse. I mean, we talked about social media earlier today, but I think the rise of counter-narrative media and that impact on the way that the traditional legacy media could control the narrative has been completely shifted. And I think that not just contributed to Trump's rise per se, but it contributed to just weird stuff happening in the States. That is really my take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think for things when you talk about like counter narratives, there's the idea of like access. And if let's say you're an impressionable 15-year-old kid, you're not going to find your way onto Alex Jones's whatever platform he's on now, because he's been deplatformed from YouTube or Twitter or what have you. But what you might do is you might go down a YouTube recommendations rabbit hole and end up on a Ben Shapiro or something of that nature. And then all of a sudden we were talking earlier about echo chambers, and there's so much, it could be left or right, but the way you have the recommendations that you're given to you of what content you listen to, it'll just keep being the same. And so I think that as opposed to getting, you could say traditional media is more unbiased. Obviously it's definitely not unbiased completely, but there's a different sort of content that you're getting if you're watching the news every night compared to if you're just watching your YouTube recommendations from content that is specifically tailored to your viewpoint.
It's all about the algorithm.
Yeah, I think what's also another important consideration to this topic is that it's just, and this might have been addressed earlier, but to bring it up again, it's really hard to distinguish what is truth and what is not truth, what is opinion, and what is fact, and also just like fact checking in general. A lot of organizations have become really sloppy about their fact checking, and you may check one organization's work with another, but it's still hard to know, if it's misinformation, and it's really easy to just find an answer and believe it, as opposed to going through thorough fact checking, because you don't have the time for that.
I really personally don't know how to feel about a lot of this counter narrative, the rise of counter narrative media, because if you think about traditional legacy media, right, what CNN and New York Times had that other people don't have is their distribution, right? They could get the newspaper to your door. They can get the cable plugged into your television. But with the internet, anybody can do anything. Anybody can become a podcaster. Anybody can spill stuff online. So this means the narratives can no longer be controlled. And once you start to control the narrative, right? If Twitter starts to censor Hunter Biden story, immediately conspiracy theories come out. Immediately other people come out. Other narratives will string up. So there's no way you can control the narrative anymore. So the Overton window has become completely widened, as what we analyzed earlier, in terms of both on the left and the right, but also the way that people engage in social political discourse and fight with each other has completely changed, right? So all of this just is, I think, is having dramatic implications on the way we're doing things right now. So if you want to tie that to the rise of Trump, I think Trump is someone who knows exactly who he's talking to, right? I mean, I still cannot believe after 3 years, I don't mean to really trash on people on the left and are educated, but college educated liberal people still cannot figure out Trump. They still get outraged by some random stuff that Trump says. I mean, can you not figure out this guy just says what the hell he wants? I mean, yes, you shouldn't tolerate it. Yes, it's bad, but it's like he just does this. But you can be outraged and you can keep getting angry and riled up by it, but it's like so many people are listening to exactly what he's saying. I mean, think about how Trump fought COVID, right? The speech that he gave in front of White House right after he came back from the hospital. It was very simple. He was like, I beat COVID. It was God helped me. I'm the winner. So you look at that, you go, that's ridiculous. He got COVID. How stupid is he? His listeners, his base would see a strong man, basically like God helping him over conquering the virus. He was like, I feel better after the virus. I mean, that's just such a unique way of distributing the message and directly connecting with the consumer, right? So the whole political game has changed, I just think.
Would say it just sets a horrible precedent, though. And what kind of example are we showing to have our president, say this, do that? But yeah.
Is Trump that horrible, though? I'm gonna okay. It's 11:30. I'm gonna start some wild questions.
Take this outside.
Not in terms of policy, in terms of his manner, in terms of
yes.
No. But by that I mean, let me justify my point.
Tiger, this is going on the internet, so you realize we can't say anything that would incriminate ourselves for the rest of our lives.
I'm sorry. I'm still on 270 doing numbers, but like what are we talking about?
I posed the question, how bad is Trump
right now, Tiger?
Yo, I'm not saying he's not bad or whatever. I'm saying
Tiger, we're gonna lose followers from this.
Why don't we stop this conversation here?
What is Tiger proposing that is so controversial? But
I'm just saying,
aside, is Donald Trump that bad in mannerisms?
If you're a liberal, yes, you would hate him. But if you're a conservative and you feel like he speaks to your heart, right? So my point is, it depends on the perspective. I'm not saying in an objective way. I mean, I'm just. By the way, I feel like I'm so liberally biased, and I'm also constantly surrounded by liberal friends that I have to constantly play devil's advocate on issues in order to get myself, refreshed on some of those issues. But yes, feel free to roast me. So,
I think.
I'll leave this to you. Good luck with this one.
Why don't we change topic? Let's change topic. Future of American conservatism. Yes, let's do that.
I don't know. I was just gonna say, I feel like you're onto something in that he speaks directly to his base, and he is successful in doing that, I think you can unequivocally say that his manner is pretty bad from, the perspective that we might have, as in like traditional political norms. And you in democracy, you depend on certain like rules of the game in order for things to function. When one person breaks those, and you start to realize how they really depend on everybody just sort of accepting them. And so, maybe it's good in that he. Go ahead.
I would say, like, beyond that, like, fuck norms, like, fuck like normal left-right conversation. Like, the denial of science is something that is fundamentally counter.
Yes. Okay. Let's not go down. Yes. We don't have to talk about the specific policy implications. Yes, I recognize all of that.
It's not even a policy implication.
Yes.
That is just like the social value of the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, going up there and denying scientists, saying that I am virtuous because I won't listen to my scientists, is just fundamentally toxic.
Okay, Sully, I agree that Trump screwed up during the coronavirus response when he denied scientists, but you've also got to realize there are other sides of the story that people see, which is that people do feel like they've completely lost faith in the government, in the state capacity, not just Trump, but also CDC, also New York City government, also New York Times and Washington Post and whatever that did tons of. So yes, I think Trump broke down, but I think it's indicative of a larger trend in where the American politics and political system is at right now. So I'm not trying to say that Trump is a wonderful president. I'm not trying to spin some Fox News narratives here. But what I'm saying is that if you really truly examine what happened in the past 6 months and stuff, it's a great awakening and reflection on the American political system and at large. The George Floyd protests are not accusations to Trump himself. It's to the larger social system, and likewise was the failure of the COVID-19 response. So yes, I agree with you that when he contradicts scientists, it's wrong. But it's not just him that's contradicting scientists. Scientists are contradicting scientists. New York Times Washington Post was contradicting scientists. And also the beginning of the narrative was that people didn't want to tell that, people that you should wear a mask because they didn't want to cause a run on a mask, whatever. There were all kinds of massive failures on the way the state was playing its role.
So I think this is a really interesting point about COVID, because in a way that we really haven't before, in a speed that's like very easy for us humans to understand and maybe like misunderstand, we've seen how actual scientific discourse works and conflated it with the failure of science. So we've said like the process of these studies, it takes a really long time in science to create like a peer-reviewed opinion about a new disease. And that's just kind of how epidemiology works. And we kind of saw that peer-reviewed process as it played out live time. And we're like, science isn't working, but science is working. We just haven't really seen that process before. And I think a lot of people use that as an opportunity to discount science when in fact they were just unfamiliar with the process.
Right, but that's not what we're doing here. We're just trying to, yes.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay.
Christian, you got any more 538 updates for us?
No. I'm still grinding through the Arizona numbers. It doesn't look like. I mean, I don't think anybody else has called it yet, so I'm no longer leaning this way. But I mean, not that I'm leaning the opposite way, but I'm just saying it doesn't look as solid as I might have thought.
I think. Do you have any sort of like what do you think we'll know by the end of the night tonight? I guess as we get closer to midnight.
Well, look, okay.
I don't think we're going to know anything additionally about Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania, though.
So, and that's essentially what we need to know. We need to. What is the term for these states? Can someone remind me what they call
the blue wall?
Thank you, the blue wall. When we get down to, I can't believe that's such an annoying term, but it is the blue wall. The question, I think, ultimately is just going to end up, if Arizona does go blue, as Fox claims that it's going to, as of. I'm sorry, Neil, I don't know if you were here when we're talking about it, but Fox called it for Biden in Arizona as of 30, 40 minutes ago. So we're now sitting on that. And with that, the point there is that there's a path to victory for Biden through what's it called? The blue.
Oh, sorry, blue wall.
The blue wall. The blue wall.
Yeah, sorry, I was reading something else.
I'm just gonna write it on my hand so I don't forget it. The blue wall, right? That doesn't include Pennsylvania necessarily. So ultimately, like what we're gonna end up looking at here, now that we know that Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, et cetera, like those are all going red, is that it's gonna come down to Arizona, Ohio, Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania's gonna take forever, and then the blue wall.
This may just be semantics, but is the Rust Belt, like the differentiation between the Rust Belt and the blue wall is Pennsylvania and Ohio?
The blue wall.
The Rust Belt goes further.
Yeah.
Right.
When people talk about the blue wall, they historically, at least like in the last 10 years or whatever, 12 years, have meant Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And then you could say Rust Belt includes Ohio, Indiana, parts of Illinois, right?
Yeah.
But
there's one topic we haven't touched on tonight. I don't know if you guys want to get into it, which is the economic policy outlook and what the hell is going to happen in the next couple of months as COVID-19 unfolds. It seems to me that my thesis is that we will not see a V-shaped recovery. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that. If you guys are optimistic, I'll just do a little bit of general polling for now.
I mean, I agree. I saw, I'm sure Tiger, you do too. I follow a lot of economists on Twitter, and with the peak in coronavirus cases today in the U.S., today was a peak. The projected economic, shocks or whatever in the future is that it's going to be like a W recovery. We took the big hit a little bit, and then it's going to fall back again. I think, depending on, regardless of who wins the election, Donald Trump will be president until at least January 20th or whatever, 21st. And hopefully the government, Congress can get something through to help address that. But, it's just a mess right now. So who really knows?
It's also interesting to think about in that, like, the economy might not ever return to like the normal that we had pre-COVID. Like it might, in terms of like GDP, it might like be this like a higher or the same number. But it's interesting to think about like how the economy might be different in terms of like a post-COVID world. Like, I don't know, just like a basic example could be that like more people might work from home and how that might shape like urbanism and whether or not people choose to live in urban areas.
By the way, I just to follow up on David's point, it's GDP might come back, but yes, there will be profound implications as things like inequality and things like that. But one other thing is the stock markets, which is really, really interesting. Financial markets. I mean, stock markets has been on a roll. It's on a boom, and it seems that we'll continue to see a huge boom after the election outcome because that's one thing we didn't touch on election season because historically, whatever election outcome may be, the stock market has always gone a boom, especially when people get a little bit more of a clarity. And right now it's volatile. So last week we saw a huge dip in the stock markets, but it's going to pick back up soon. And it seems that the stock markets can always justify whatever narrative that is needed to justify its rise, right? So if it's Trump, then it's pro-tax, pro-business, lower tax, right? If it's the Democrats, then Biden will have a bigger stimulus plan. It will be so. There's always some kind of narrative that propels this thing from keeping going. So then that has all kinds of implications. And then one other thing I think we clearly touched on, this is a topic I do feel quite passionate about, is the deficit. People have been talking about the deficits for a while. Some of us, you guys brought up today, which is that Trump is not traditionally, the kind of fiscally conservative people. We have people on the other spectrum, which is Bernie Sanders and AOC, who keep saying that, modern monetary theory, deficits don't matter. You just need to keep printing money and things like that, which, to be honest, like nobody at this point really knows what's happening with the deficits because we've had such a historically high deficits, $4 trillion, while at historically low interest rates. And we've been at this historically low interest rate for so long, and we're still seeing no sign of inflation. And if you don't have significant inflation, it does not so it means your high deficit isn't really causing you a problem, right? We're not, so the central bank can keep printing money. You can keep having greater deficits, but you're not seeing what you saw in Germany during the 1930s or something, right? People keep referring those examples of like, if you keep printing money, it will go hyperinflation, but we're just not seeing that. So, which is really, really a fascinating topic. Like, what is the future of monetary policy, right? Because the Federal Reserve right now has run out of tools to stimulate the economy. Like they can't do anything anymore. And right now, the only thing you could do is fiscal stimulus, right? So from the Capitol Hill, and people are calling for more of those, but there's hyperpartisanship and you can't get anything through. And that goes back to the fundamental question: is the economic policy outlook? And it seems that with the cases keep rising without a clear, strategy for the public health, social distancing rules, without a clear exit strategy on all those things. It seems we're not getting there. We're just really not getting to that V-shaped recovery. I'm personally not very optimistic. You should still invest in equities because the stock markets will be on a boom. But that's kind of it. Anyways, I just thought it would be a nice time filler. My friend Aishi has texted me. She said inflation should not be uttered after 11 p.m. I'm sorry if that causes any mental stress to anybody.
Tiger, I think you're also forgetting that money is made up, which I think is key here.
It is a social construct. That's what I keep telling people. But yes. Aishi, do you want to say hi to us? What's up, Vic? Okay.
Hi, Tiger.
What made you guys join the Zoom call so late? Do you have any questions? You're the first listener that called in today.
A lot. And it just got to the point where it was a little bit sad, and so we tuned in.
What do you mean by it's a little bit of sad? Our elections coverage has been going so well. I mean, we've covered so many topics. We're going strong. How many people have tuned in? Let me give you guys the stats. We have a great
a strong 12 right now. I just want to say hi.
No, listen.
Everyone who's stuck with us.
All people at the current time, but cumulatively, we've had more than 300 people. More than 300 people, which is great.
Tiger, I'm impressed you were able to make 300 alt accounts.
Yeah, it's 300 bots. It's a phone bank.
Yeah, listen. Small victories. That's what Aishi taught me. Actually, I was saying I was really depressed a couple days ago. She was like, "You got to take small victories every day." So today, small victory. We got some good stream going on. Where are we at with the results, guys? We're
nowhere. It's
listen.
We're in slow motion right now.
I've been saying this since a while ago. I sent you, by the way, for any of our listeners, you can sign up for our daily email. I send every day a daily email to our subscribers about what's going on in the markets. I hear things and whatever. But it seems, I've been saying this for a while, that we're going to have a contested election. By contested, I mean it's going to drag out for a long, long time.
That's not to be pedantic, but that is not what that is.
Well,
right, because ultimately contested election refers to
yes.
one of the campaigns and or political parties litigating against the other.
I do think that's also that will very likely happen. Yes,
to challenge the results. I don't think that's out of the question. I think that's entirely possible.
I think that's entirely possible.
If you take Texas as any proxy for that, however, even in a very conservative state with an all-Republican Supreme Court, those things do get laughed out of the courtroom. Like they do get pretty frequently disregarded just because the standing is an issue. So by that, I mean that sometimes people actually don't have a legal case to bring to the court, for one. So what I'm trying to say in short is that on a state-by-state basis, on a county-by-county basis, it's very, very hard to litigate about the results of elections that are very typically very, very well organized and thought out. So in other words, like, they can throw lawyers at these things if they want to, but it's going to be quite difficult. They're not necessarily going to make any headway. They may make a big storm. People may get very upset, but that doesn't mean that they'll make any actual legal headway.
One thing is, like, if you think to the example of 2000, like the Supreme Court decided an election. Like, I think there can be significance to these kind of like legal cases involving voting.
Definitely. But there was an argument to be made about Florida, right? In a way that there isn't necessarily this time. I mean, no. Don't get me wrong, Matthew. I see you shaking your head. I'm not saying that I agree with the Supreme Court's decision. I'm saying that they had standing. They had an argument to make in a way that I don't believe would necessarily happen this time. It would take quite, I think, some unlikely things to happen for there to be a legitimate legal challenge to the results of the election. All that is to say, I don't think it will be contested. It will drag on, though. I think that we're heading possibly, due to the way this is playing out tonight, into a scenario where we really don't know anything until tomorrow morning.
Not to throw
tomorrow morning. Okay, sorry.
No, I think it's like Friday, but not to throw another topic in, but I just got a notification saying that the Georgia Senate race is going to run off.
Wait, between Ossoff and Purdue?
No, between Warnock and Loeffler.
What?
Yeah, because it was a special Senate race, so someone had to get a majority of the votes for it not to go to a runoff.
So that was okay. That was what's the guy's name?
Warnock.
Who? No. The other guy that ran against Warnock as like his as sort of like a
Lieberman. Lieberman.
Yeah, thank you. That was Lieberman, right?
Yeah, but Lieberman's out. And I thought he dropped out before the election. I forget that.
I thought someone was running in this as like a third party candidate.
Yeah, there's running against. There's another Republican running, so that's why. So the Republican vote was split in this case.
Yeah. That's what it was. But in any case, that's why the runoff happened. I think
it'd be really interesting if kind of like next to like a contested election in the courts, you also have this kind of like proxy war going on in Georgia where both parties are just pumping so much money into that runoff.
Interesting choice to use the word interesting there, Sully, because that seems more apocalyptic to me than interesting.
Well, yes.
Is anybody checking anything about new polling results? Because right now I'm not sure if my
South Carolina went to Trump, so right now we're at the Biden 192 and Trump 114, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, South Carolina is no surprise at all, but yeah, still a question about the South, still a question about AZ and PA, obviously.
Not too late to make your predictions right now. Why don't we make a round of predictions? Who's gonna take North Carolina, for example?
For Biden?
I mean, has North Carolina been called already?
No, but it would be shocking if it went blue. It's nearly certainly going red.
What about Pennsylvania? You guys think?
No.
The decision desk just projected Biden to win Maine's first district, and would that be the one electoral vote that could prevent a tie, or am I off on that?
Wait, who won it?
Biden.
Yeah, that could do it.
Okay.
So that means Michigan, Wisconsin, it's over.
Possibly.
What is our policy? What's our official projection? We said we're going to predict the winner. Iowa, maybe Trump, just to be contrarian, that we can.
This one's enough of a nail biter that you can be contrarian by picking either. Still,
dude, I've been saying about this for such a long time and nobody believes.
You've been saying it's going to be a contested election. That's not the same thing.
Yeah, well, let's see how this contested elections go. Listen, if it's a contested election, then there's incumbent advantage. That's what I want.
Okay, right? Tiger, do you remember that Princeton professor that made a deal about like the results of the election?
Plug? Yeah, Sam Wang, Professor Wang. We had him on the show about gerrymandering. Yes. If he yeah, okay. What do you want me to do then? Like, what are we betting on, by the way?
Well, now that I remember how it played out for him, I'm not so sure I want to make that bet.
Listen,
I was going to make a bold claim about how unlikely contested the result was, but now I'm not so sure because I really don't want to do that.
Because here's the thing, though. You can't for someone like Nate Silver's bets, you can't construct bets off that, right? 90% likelihood favoring Biden. That's like a 10-to-1, money kind of situation. Like, it's absurd. I mean, it just wouldn't happen anyways.
Tiger, I just want to correct myself, by the way. The district that's close in Maine is the second electoral district, so Biden winning the first is irrelevant to any possible outcome that. Yeah.
Well, Biden seems to be in a huge lead, right? I mean, so I don't know.
In Maine, he's at a 20,000 vote lead from what I can tell right now.
That's okay. So Montana.
One thing about Montana, I think the Senate race, Steve Bullock is running like 7 points ahead of Biden, which is kind of interesting. I don't think that was, I mean, I think he's a pretty popular governor, but I don't think anyone expected such a big ticket split over there. So I guess something else to keep an eye on.
But any thoughts on the southern states? Because we said we're going to do a quick deep dive, Neil, and also Christian. Like Christian, you're from Texas. You kept telling me that Texas might go blue this year.
Yeah,
which I think is ridiculous.
Total insanity, of course. Terrible prediction. I should have known better, but I never learn anything. So
liberals never learn.
No, we don't, and especially Southern Democrats in particular have a nasty habit of about imagining things. So
we're so optimistic.
Yeah. With that said, we're still, Florida. Yeah, Florida's over. Yeah, it's done. It's gone.
Neil, what about Montana or something? Neil, what's going on your end?
Yeah, so I just like what I was saying, I think people are noticing that Steve Bullock is like pulling ahead, even though Biden and Trump are neck and neck. So that's like an odd sort of seat that I think we should keep an eye on, but I'm not expecting, I mean, it's obviously one of those underdog Senate seats for the Democrats.
I see. So what's going on in the southern states? Anything else that's
nope.
Okay. No. Okay, I guess this is the night. I mean, we won't know the results tonight for sure, right? It sounds like, yeah. Any other major points or topics that we kind of missed? I mean, we really covered a lot of grounds today. Very proud of you guys and the team.
It could be argued that Arizona is. Sorry, I just got. Okay, sorry about that. I was going to say the Arizona thing could be argued to be the revenge of the McCain legacy. He had obviously a very long-standing and deep connection to the state, and I think that the whole controversy about that certainly played into the results tonight. I think that's definitely worth thinking about. Aside from that, Pennsylvania, we're still at 54% reporting. It's really anyone's game there. No one knows. Folks, I got to sign off now. I got to go check in with my parents, but it was great hanging out with everyone.
It's midnight. This is great. Thanks so much for doing this, guys. I mean, it's super proud of our team and what we pulled through. 4 hours. It's any other last minute comments before Christian and we gradually sign off? Any other thoughts? No thoughts from. Yeah.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
This is great. We spent so much time trying to put this thing together. It's been such a struggle getting the system going and the technicalities and stuff. We really appreciate you. We still have 12 people watching right now. Really, really appreciate all the support. It's just been you make the time worthwhile for all of us.
Have a great night, everyone. I got a jet. It was a ton of fun. Take care.
Tons of fun. See you guys soon. That concludes our coverage. You can follow us on policypunchline.com. Listen to us on iTunes, Spotify, any platform you want. And also sign up for our newsletter. I send some daily news emails, some secrets that I hear here and there. And take care, everybody. We'll keep you posted about what happens in this election.
Good night.
Thanks, Tiger.
Also get our book if you're still on the stream.
yes, we're gonna put out another book soon. So that's another thing. But Matt, thanks so much for coming, and I'm gonna stop the stream now.